In September 1938, world leaders gathered in Munich to discuss the fate of Czechoslovakia. There, in that room, the future of a nation was decided without its voice. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, French Premier Édouard Daladier, and Italy's Mussolini sat with Hitler, all hoping to avoid another devastating war. They believed that if they gave him the Sudetenland, he would be satisfied, that it would be enough to quench his thirst for power. But Hitler's ambition was insatiable. The Munich Agreement was signed, and just like that, Czechoslovakia was betrayed. The Sudetenland was handed over to Hitler without a single shot being fired. Chamberlain returned to Britain, declaring that they had achieved peace for our time. But that peace was nothing more than an illusion, a fragile lie that would soon shatter. For the people of Czechoslovakia, it was a nightmare. They had been abandoned by their allies, left to face the coming storm alone. In the Sudetenland, Nazi forces quickly took control. The swastika flew over towns that had once been free, and for the Czechs, the future looked terrifying. They knew that Hitler would not stop with the Sudetenland. They knew that their entire country was at risk. And they were right. In March 1939, just months after the Munich Agreement, Hitler sent his troops into the rest of Czechoslovakia. This time, there were no grand speeches about saving ethnic Germans, no excuses about oppression. It was a raw display of power, an invasion driven purely by greed and ambition. Czechoslovakia fell, and the world finally saw the truth: Hitler could not be appeased. He would take what he wanted, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to stop him. The streets of Prague echoed with the sound of Nazi boots. People watched in horror as their country, their home, was swallowed by the Third Reich. Fear hung heavy in the air. Those who had fought for Czechoslovakia's independence just 2 decades earlier now found themselves under the crushing weight of Nazi rule. Families were torn apart, lives were shattered, and a darkness spread across the land. And yet, the world remained frozen. Leaders who had hoped to prevent war were now faced with the reality that it was coming, whether they were ready or not. Hitler had shown his hand, and it was clear that no agreement, no negotiation, would stop him. His expansionist aims were not just about land, they were about power, control, and domination. The invasion of Czechoslovakia was a turning point. It was the moment when the world could no longer deny the true threat that Hitler posed. He had already swallowed Austria and the Sudetenland, and now he had taken an entire country. Europe stood on the edge of catastrophe, and the people who had once cheered for peace were beginning to understand that peace would not come easily. As the swastikas flew over the castles of Prague, as the Nazi soldiers marched through the streets, the people of Europe held their breath. They knew what was coming. They could feel it in the air, in the whispers of fear that echoed across borders. Hitler's ambition would not stop with Czechoslovakia. This was only the beginning. War was on the horizon, and the world could only wait, helpless, as Hitler's shadow stretched ever further across Europe. It began with hope, fragile and desperate. Europe stood on the edge, clinging to the belief that war could still be avoided. The memories of the last great conflict were still fresh, millions dead, families shattered, cities reduced to rubble. No one wanted to return to that. The leaders of Britain and France believed they could find a way to keep the peace, to stop the dark storm that was gathering across the continent. But hope can be a dangerous thing, especially when it blinds you to the truth. Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, was determined to avoid another war. He had seen what the First World War had done to his country, to the world. The trenches, the blood, the endless lists of the dead. He couldn't bear the thought of leading Britain into another nightmare like that. So, when Adolf Hitler began his push for expansion, Chamberlain believed that diplomacy was the answer. He believed that by giving Hitler what he wanted, the Nazi leader would be satisfied, that Europe could avoid the carnage that seemed so inevitable. The policy of appeasement became Chamberlain's strategy. When Hitler demanded the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia, Chamberlain didn't hesitate. He flew to Munich, meeting with Hitler, hoping to strike a deal that would prevent war. The world watched as these two men, one a democratically elected leader, the other a dictator bent on domination, sat across from each other. Chamberlain, convinced that he could talk sense into Hitler, agreed to hand over the Sudetenland without a fight. He believed it was a small price to pay for peace. When Chamberlain returned to London, he held up the agreement like a trophy, declaring that he had secured peace for our time. The crowds cheered. There were tears of relief. The threat of war, it seemed, had been averted. But beneath the surface, something far darker was unfolding. Hitler wasn't satisfied. The Sudetenland was just a stepping stone, and as Chamberlain celebrated, the Nazi war machine continued to grow, its appetite for conquest unquenched. Appeasement had failed, though few realized it at the time. The leaders of Britain and France still hoped that Hitler's ambitions could be contained through negotiations, through treaties. But with each concession, Hitler grew bolder, his vision of a greater Germany expanding far beyond the borders of the Sudetenland. The signs were there, in his speeches, and the way he treated each new diplomatic victory as a green light for further aggression. But Europe's leaders, desperate to avoid conflict, chose not to see them. Then came the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a moment that stunned the world. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, two sworn enemies, came together in a secret agreement. For years, Hitler had railed against communism, calling it a threat to the Aryan race. Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, had preached the evils of fascism. Yet, in August 1939, the two dictators sat down and signed a non-aggression pact. The world held its breath, unable to comprehend what had just happened. The pact was more than just a promise not to attack each other. It was a chilling arrangement to carve up Eastern Europe between them. Poland, a proud nation that had rebuilt itself after centuries of foreign rule, was to be divided like spoils between Germany and the Soviet Union. The ink was barely dry on the agreement when the tanks started rolling. Hitler invaded Poland from the west on September 1, 1939. 17 days later, Soviet forces marched in from the east. Poland, caught in a vice between two brutal regimes, fell in a matter of weeks. The streets of Warsaw were filled with the sounds of bombs, the cries of terrified families trying to escape the chaos. Children clung to their parents, not understanding why their world was crumbling around them. Soldiers fought valiantly, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and overwhelmed. The people of Poland had hoped that Britain and France would come to their aid, that the promises of protection made just months earlier would be honored. But help never came. The fall of Poland shattered any illusions that diplomacy could save Europe. Hitler had shown his true face, and the world was forced to confront the reality that he would not stop until he had taken everything. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was proof that even the most unlikely of alliances could be forged in the pursuit of power. It was a cynical deal, one that allowed Hitler to turn his attention westward, knowing that the Soviet Union would stay out of the fight, at least for the time being. As the bombs fell on Poland, as the cities burned, and as millions of lives were uprooted, the failure of diplomacy became painfully clear. Chamberlain's dreams of peace had been crushed under the boots of Nazi soldiers. The policy of appeasement, which had been born out of fear and hope, had only served to embolden Hitler. Each diplomatic failure, each concession, had led Europe closer to the brink. The road to war had been paved with broken promises and misplaced trust. And now, the war had begun. There was no turning back. Diplomacy had failed. The world had tried to negotiate with a man who could not be reasoned with, and now they were paying the price. Hitler's thirst for power could not be sated by treaties or agreements. He had played the leaders of Europe, using their desire for peace to buy himself time, to prepare his forces, to build his empire. As the storm of war swept across Europe, those who had believed in diplomacy and the power of negotiation were left in shock and disbelief. The policy of appeasement had been a tragic miscalculation, one that had given Hitler the time and space he needed to unleash his full fury upon the world. Now, there was only war. It was a calm September morning, and the people of Poland woke up to what they thought would be another ordinary day. Families were going about their routines, children heading off to school, merchants setting up their shops. But in the early hours of September 1, 1939, everything changed. The sky over Poland darkened, not from clouds, but from the roar of aircraft engines. The sound was deafening, filling the air with an overwhelming sense of dread. Within minutes, bombs began raining down. The terror of Blitzkrieg had begun. Blitzkrieg, lightning war. It was unlike anything the world had ever seen before. German forces struck with terrifying speed and precision. There was no warning, no time to prepare. Tanks rolled across the border, smashing through Polish defenses as if they were made of paper. The soldiers of Poland fought bravely, but they were no match for the sheer power of the Nazi war machine. Within hours, entire towns were engulfed in flames. Families huddled together, praying for safety, but there was nowhere to hide. The destruction came too fast, too suddenly. In Warsaw, the capital, fear gripped the city. The distant rumble of explosions drew closer with each passing day. The people listened to the radio, hoping for news that the Polish army had managed to hold the line, that help was on the way. But the news was always the same: Germany was advancing, unstoppable. Streets once filled with laughter and life now echoed with the cries of panic and chaos. Mothers clutched their children, not knowing if they would survive the night. Fathers looked on, helpless to protect their families from the terror that was closing in. As the days passed, Warsaw itself became a target. German planes swooped low over the city, dropping bomb after bomb, turning homes, schools, and hospitals into rubble. The smell of smoke filled the air, mixing with the acrid stench of fear. The sound of collapsing buildings and sirens created a nightmarish soundtrack to the suffering. People rushed into underground shelters, praying the next bomb wouldn't find them. The soldiers on the front lines were fighting with everything they had, but it wasn't enough. The Polish army, outnumbered and outgunned, was being overwhelmed from every direction. Blitzkrieg was more than just a military tactic, it was a psychological assault. The speed and brutality of the attack left no room for hope. German tanks were relentless, plowing through villages and crushing any resistance. Polish soldiers, many still on horseback, were no match for the modern, mechanized might of the Nazi forces. In the skies, German planes bombed supply lines, cutting off vital resources. It was as if an unstoppable wave of destruction had been unleashed, and nothing could stand in its way. The fall of Warsaw came swiftly. On September 28, less than a month after the invasion began, the city surrendered. The once vibrant capital lay in ruins. Its people were broken, exhausted, and in mourning. The streets, where children had once played, were now littered with the remnants of shattered lives. The heart of Poland had been torn out, and the world watched in shock. In the aftermath, there were no celebrations in Warsaw, only silence, grief, and the eerie calm of a city that had been brought to its knees. For the Polish people, the invasion was not just the loss of their homeland, it was the loss of their future. Families torn apart, homes destroyed, communities erased in a matter of weeks. And yet, as the dust settled, there was still a spark of defiance in their hearts. They may have been conquered, but they would not forget. They would resist, they would fight back, in whatever way they could. The spirit of Poland was not so easily extinguished, even in the face of such overwhelming devastation. But this wasn't just the fall of one country. It was the moment the world changed forever. The invasion of Poland marked the beginning of the deadliest conflict humanity had ever known. The dark cloud of war that had loomed over Europe for so long had finally broken open, and its storm would spread across the globe. The leaders of Britain and France, who had watched Hitler's rise with growing unease, could no longer stand on the sidelines. They had tried to negotiate, to reason, to keep the peace, but now there was no choice. The invasion of Poland was too brutal, too blatant to ignore. 2 days later, on September 3, 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The world was now officially at war. In Poland, there were no celebrations for this declaration. It came too late for those who had already seen their homes destroyed, their loved ones killed. But the hope was that, somehow, the world's response would bring an end to the nightmare that had engulfed their nation. The hope was that the sacrifices made by Poland would not be in vain. The speed and ferocity of Blitzkrieg shocked the world. The idea that a country could be brought to its knees in such a short amount of time was something many couldn't comprehend. But it was real. The streets of Warsaw were proof. The smoking ruins of Polish towns were proof. The cries of the displaced, the orphaned, the widowed, they were all proof that the horrors of the First World War had not been enough to prevent another. Blitzkrieg was more than just a military strategy. It was a weapon of terror. It was designed to break the spirit of a people, to leave them feeling helpless and defeated. And in Poland, it had worked. But what the Nazis didn't realize was that the spirit of resistance could never truly be crushed. In the forests, in the underground bunkers, in the whispered conversations between neighbors, the seeds of rebellion were already being planted. As the last Polish soldiers laid down their weapons, as the Nazi flag was raised over the ashes of Warsaw, a new chapter of the world's darkest history began. What had started in Poland would soon engulf all of Europe, and then the world. The invasion of Poland was not just the start of a war, it was the start of a nightmare that would take years to end, and millions of lives with it. The world held its breath. War had been declared, but for months, nothing happened. After the fall of Poland, Europe seemed frozen in time. It was an eerie calm, a silence that felt wrong. Soldiers lined the borders, staring out at an enemy they knew was there but couldn't see. Families listened to the radio with a mixture of fear and confusion, waiting for the bombs to fall, for the chaos to begin. But there was nothing. It was the calm before the storm, a storm that would hit harder than anyone could have imagined. This strange period, where the guns stayed silent and the bombs remained in their chambers, became known as the Phony War. It was as if the world was holding its breath, knowing that something terrible was about to happen, but not knowing when. The fear was suffocating. In France, soldiers huddled in their bunkers along the Maginot Line, a vast network of fortifications that was supposed to keep them safe. They believed that they were prepared, that they were ready for whatever the Germans would throw at them. But they were wrong. For months, there was no movement. It was as if both sides were playing a twisted waiting game, daring the other to make the first move. But in the minds of the German commanders, the plan was already in motion. Hitler had no intention of sitting idly by. He was planning something that would shock the world, something that would bring France to its knees. And then, in May 1940, the storm hit. The Germans unleashed a second wave of blitzkrieg, but this time, it wasn't aimed at Poland. It was aimed at the heart of Western Europe. German tanks and soldiers tore through Belgium and the Netherlands with terrifying speed, catching the Allies off guard. The Maginot Line, which the French had believed would protect them, was bypassed entirely. Hitler's forces attacked from the north, where the defenses were weakest. Panic swept through France like wildfire. The speed of the German advance was unlike anything the French had seen before. Towns and villages were swallowed up in a matter of hours. Refugees poured into the roads, desperate to escape the oncoming terror. They carried what little they could with bundles of clothes, children clinging to their parents' hands, the elderly lagging behind. The roads became choked with people fleeing for their lives, not knowing where to go or if there was even anywhere left to run. In Paris, the mood was one of disbelief. This couldn't be happening. France was one of the most powerful nations in the world, with a military that had stood tall for generations. How could they be falling so quickly? How could everything unravel in a matter of weeks? The German tanks seemed unstoppable, cutting through the French countryside like a knife through butter. The French army, despite its bravery, was overwhelmed. The carefully laid plans and strategies crumbled in the face of the relentless German assault. Communication lines were severed, orders became confused, and chaos reigned. French soldiers fought valiantly, but they were no match for the lightning-fast tactics of blitzkrieg. The skies were filled with the roar of German planes, dropping bombs that reduced entire towns to rubble. By June, the German forces were closing in on Paris. The city that had once been a beacon of culture and beauty was now under siege. Fear gripped the hearts of Parisians as they watched the black smoke rise on the horizon, knowing that the enemy was approaching. The streets that had once been filled with life were now empty, as people barricaded themselves in their homes, praying for a miracle that would never come. On June 14, 1940, the unthinkable happened. Paris fell. German troops marched through the streets of the city, their boots echoing off the cobblestone. The Eiffel Tower stood as a silent witness to the horror unfolding below. The French tricolor flag was lowered, and in its place, the Nazi swastika was raised. The city of light had been consumed by darkness. The fall of Paris sent shockwaves across the world. It wasn't just the fall of a city, it was the fall of hope, the fall of everything the French people believed in. Their homeland had been conquered, their pride shattered. People who had once walked those streets freely now lived under the shadow of Nazi occupation, their every move watched, their freedom stripped away. But the nightmare wasn't over. The collapse of France wasn't just about the loss of Paris, it was the total destruction of a nation's spirit. On June 22, 1940, France officially surrendered to Germany. The humiliation was complete. The country that had once stood strong, that had fought bravely in the First World War, had been brought to its knees in just 6 weeks. It was a defeat that no one had seen coming, and one that would haunt France for years to come. The soldiers who had fought so hard were now prisoners, or worse. Many had died in the battle, their bodies lying forgotten in the fields they had tried so desperately to defend. Those who survived faced the crushing reality of occupation, their country now under the iron grip of Nazi rule. For the French people, the future looked bleak. Their government had fled to Vichy, where a puppet regime would be installed, working under the orders of their German overlords. The phony war had ended in the most brutal way imaginable. What had started as a strange, quiet standoff had erupted into a full-blown disaster. The fall of France marked a turning point in the war, a moment when it became clear that no one was safe from the reach of the Nazi regime. For the people of France, the nightmare had only just begun. Across the English Channel, Britain watched in horror. They had stood by their ally, believing that France could hold out, that the combined might of their armies could stop Hitler. But now, they were alone. The fall of France meant that Britain was next. The shadow of Nazi Germany loomed larger than ever, and the question on everyone's lips was terrifying: would Britain be able to withstand what France could not? As the French people tried to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, the rest of the world could only watch and wait for the next move. The skies over Britain darkened with a thunderous roar. The people below could only look up, their hearts pounding in their chests. This was no ordinary storm. It was the sound of war, a war that was about to take place high above their heads. The year was 1940, and Britain stood alone. Hitler had crushed Europe, but there was one small island nation that refused to bow down. The Luftwaffe, Germany's feared air force, had its sights set on Britain. Their mission was clear: break the spirit of the British people, bomb them into submission, and pave the way for an invasion. But what Hitler didn't count on was the sheer determination of the British people and the unmatched bravery of the RAF, the Royal Air Force. These were young men, many of them barely out of their teens, who strapped themselves into their Spitfires and Hurricanes and flew into battle, knowing the odds were against them. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and yet, they fought with everything they had. Day after day, they soared into the skies, not knowing if they would ever return. On the ground, the people of Britain braced themselves for the worst. The Blitz had begun. Every night, as darkness fell, the sirens would wail, sending a chill down the spine of every man, woman, and child. Families hurried into their bomb shelters, clutching one another as the deafening sounds of German bombers filled the air. And then, the bombs would fall. The earth shook violently, buildings crumbled, and the sky lit up with the orange glow of fires burning across the city. London, the heart of the nation, took the brunt of the Blitz. Streets that had once been filled with life were now reduced to rubble. Homes were destroyed, lives shattered in an instant. But even in the face of this relentless onslaught, the people refused to break. When morning came, they emerged from their shelters, brushing the dust off their clothes, and they began to rebuild. Neighbors helped one another, strangers became friends, and there was a sense of unity, a shared resilience that no bomb could destroy. For the RAF, the fight in the skies was just as brutal. They faced the full might of the Luftwaffe, who outnumbered them in both planes and pilots. But what the RAF lacked in numbers, they made up for in courage. Every time they took to the skies, they knew they might not come back. And yet, they went anyway. They fought with a fierce determination, refusing to let the enemy break through. The dogfights above the clouds were intense. Pilots pushed their planes to the limit, dodging enemy fire, weaving through the air with breathtaking skill. The sound of machine guns rattled through the skies, and the acrid smell of burning fuel filled the air. Planes spiraled out of control, plummeting to the ground in fiery explosions. Many brave souls lost their lives, their planes crashing into the sea or the fields below. But for every pilot that fell, another took his place, ready to continue the fight. On the ground, the British people listened to the radio, hearing the names of fallen pilots, knowing that their sons, brothers, and husbands were up there, risking everything. Mothers cried silently, children asked when their fathers would come home, and yet, there was an unbreakable spirit. The phrase "keep calm and carry on" wasn't just a slogan, it was a way of life. No matter how many bombs fell, no matter how many buildings were destroyed, the British people refused to be defeated. Night after night, the bombs kept coming. The Blitz tore through cities like Coventry, Birmingham, and Liverpool, leaving nothing but ruins in its wake. Yet, through the horror, there were moments of incredible bravery. Firefighters risked their lives to battle the flames, pulling people from the wreckage. Ordinary citizens became heroes, helping their neighbors, offering comfort in the darkest of times. And all the while, the RAF continued to fight. The pilots became legends in their own time. Names like Douglas Bader and Sailor Mallon were whispered with admiration, their feats of bravery told and retold. They were the few, as Churchill famously called them, and they were the last line of defense. These men, with their nerves of steel, flew into battle knowing that if they failed, Britain would fall. The Luftwaffe tried everything. They bombed airfields, radar stations, factories, and ports. But no matter how hard they hit, the RAF stood firm. British pilots were pushed to their limits, flying multiple sorties a day, with little rest in between. Their bodies were exhausted, their minds stretched thin, but their spirit remained unbroken. And then came the turning point. Slowly but surely, the RAF began to gain the upper hand. British radar technology, though still in its infancy, played a crucial role, giving the RAF precious minutes of warning before the German planes arrived. This small advantage allowed the British pilots to be ready to meet the enemy head-on. The Luftwaffe, accustomed to overwhelming its opponents, began to falter. Their losses mounted, and their morale began to crack. As autumn wore on, the skies over Britain began to clear. The Luftwaffe had failed. Hitler had believed that Britain would crumble, that its people would surrender under the weight of the Blitz. But Britain had not been broken. The bravery of the RAF and the resilience of the British people had won the day. By October 1940, the Battle of Britain was effectively over. The Blitz would continue for months, and the war was far from won, but something had changed. For the first time, Hitler had been stopped. For the first time, the world saw that the Nazi war machine was not invincible. Britain had stood alone, and it had survived. The people of Britain had endured unimaginable suffering. Their cities lay in ruins, their homes destroyed, their loved ones lost. But they had not been defeated. The RAF had flown into the jaws of death and come out victorious. And the people, those who had huddled in shelters, who had lost everything, emerged from the rubble with their heads held high. They had faced the worst that the enemy could throw at them, and they had not given in. The Battle of Britain was not just a fight for survival, it was a fight for freedom. And in that fight, Britain had shown the world what it meant to stand strong in the face of overwhelming odds. The skies had been filled with fire, but from the ashes of destruction, a new strength had risen. Britain had been tested, and it had passed. The desert sun beat down relentlessly, turning the sand into a blistering furnace. It was a place of emptiness, where the only sounds were the howling winds and the distant rumble of war. North Africa was a battlefield unlike any other, a vast, unforgiving land where men fought not only their enemies but the scorching heat, the blinding sandstorms, and the overwhelming sense of isolation. And yet, in this barren wasteland, one of the fiercest and most desperate battles of World War II unfolded. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was the name whispered in fear and awe. His tactical brilliance had earned him a reputation as one of Germany's most formidable commanders. Rommel led the Afrika Korps with a deadly precision, his movements swift and unpredictable. For the men fighting against him, it felt like trying to stop a force of nature. British soldiers who faced him described the chilling feeling of watching his tanks appear seemingly out of nowhere, striking with terrifying speed before disappearing back into the desert. Rommel's campaign in North Africa was part of a larger Axis push to control the Mediterranean, a crucial region for both sides. Whoever controlled North Africa controlled the Suez Canal, a vital artery for oil and supplies. But it wasn't just about resources. This was a battle for dominance, a struggle to turn the tide of the war. And at its heart were the men who fought in the searing heat, their bodies and spirits tested to their limits. Operation Compass was Britain's answer to the growing Axis threat. What started as a limited raid quickly turned into one of the most successful Allied campaigns of the war. British and Commonwealth forces, led by General Richard O'Connor, surprised the Italian army, shattering their defenses and capturing thousands of prisoners. The desert became a graveyard for Italian hopes as the British forces advanced with stunning speed. But the victory was short-lived. Just when the Allies thought they had the upper hand, Rommel arrived. With his arrival, the Desert War took on a new intensity. The British soon found themselves on the defensive, struggling to keep up with Rommel's daring maneuvers. He led his troops in a series of lightning-fast assaults, pushing the Allies back toward Egypt. His tactics were unconventional, his strategies bold, and for a time, it seemed as though nothing could stop him. In the midst of this chaos, a small island in the Mediterranean became a symbol of resilience. Malta, positioned between Italy and North Africa, was a critical base for the Allies. The Axis powers knew that if they could take Malta, they could cut off Allied supply lines and turn the tide in North Africa once and for all. So they unleashed a siege unlike any other. For the people of Malta, life became a nightmare. The island was bombed relentlessly, day after day, by the German Luftwaffe and Italian Air Force. The sky was filled with the roar of engines and the deafening sound of explosions. Buildings crumbled, homes were destroyed, and entire families were left with nothing. But despite the devastation, the people of Malta refused to give in. They lived in constant fear, knowing that death could fall from the sky at any moment. Yet they found the strength to carry on, to rebuild their shattered homes, and to keep fighting. British forces stationed on the island were pushed to their limits, their resources stretched thin. Food and supplies ran low, and the soldiers who defended Malta were worn down by the relentless attacks. But the island held on. The bravery of its people and the determination of its defenders became a rallying cry for the Allies. Malta refused to fall. As Rommel continued his push in North Africa, the tide of battle shifted once again. British forces, bolstered by reinforcements and crucial supplies that had made it through to Malta, began to regroup. General Bernard Montgomery took command of the Eighth Army, determined to stop Rommel's advance. The two sides clashed in a series of brutal battles, each more fierce than the last. The desert became a deadly chessboard, with every move carefully calculated. Rommel's forces were stretched thin, and the supply lines that once seemed secure were now vulnerable. The war of attrition had begun to take its toll. British and Commonwealth forces launched counterattacks, driving Rommel's troops back across the desert. The battle for North Africa was far from over, but for the first time, it seemed that the Allies might have a chance to turn the tide. The siege of Malta continued to drag on, with the island's defenders refusing to give in. The people endured unimaginable hardship, their lives reduced to a daily struggle for survival. Yet their spirit remained unbroken. In 1942, King George VI awarded the George Cross to the entire population of Malta for their heroism and resilience during the siege. It was a rare and profound honor, and it spoke to the indomitable will of a people who had faced the full fury of the Axis powers and survived. In the end, the combined efforts of the Allies in North Africa and the resilience of Malta paid off. Rommel's forces, once seemingly unstoppable, were defeated at the Battle of El Alamein in 1942. It was a turning point in the war, a moment when the Axis advance was finally halted. The desert, once a place of uncertainty and fear, had become a battleground where the Allies had reclaimed their hope. But the cost had been high. Thousands of lives were lost, and the scars of war were etched deep into the sands of North Africa. The men who had fought there, whether on the side of the Allies or the Axis, were forever changed. They had endured the searing heat, the brutal conditions, and the ever-present threat of death. And yet, through it all, they had fought with everything they had. The Mediterranean, once a place of beauty and peace, had become a theater of war. The islands, the coasts, the waters, all were stained with the blood of those who had fought and died. But in the end, the resilience of Malta, the bravery of the soldiers, and the determination of the Allied commanders had made the difference. Rommel's legend as the Desert Fox lived on, but even he could not overcome the relentless pressure of a united and determined enemy. The tide had turned, and from the ashes of North Africa and the Mediterranean, a new hope for victory began to rise. The ground trembled beneath the weight of advancing soldiers. The air was thick with dust, smoke, and the cries of the innocent. In the vast landscape of China, entire cities were engulfed in flames, the screams of the dying echoing through the streets. Japan's ambition for dominance in Asia had reached a terrifying crescendo, and the world was beginning to realize the full extent of its cruelty. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, a trickle of Japanese troops moving into Manchuria in 1931. At first, it seemed like a small, localized conflict, one that would be over before anyone truly noticed. But Japan had bigger plans, and this was only the beginning. The dream of an empire of the rising sun was not limited to just one small region. It stretched across the entire Pacific, reaching into China, Southeast Asia, and beyond. In 1937, the flames of war erupted in full force as Japanese forces launched a brutal invasion of China. The city of Nanking became the stage for one of the most horrific chapters in the history of the 20th century. It was a nightmare unlike anything the people of China had ever imagined. Thousands of civilians were slaughtered, and the city was left in ruins. The Japanese soldiers, driven by a merciless ideology, committed atrocities that would haunt humanity for generations. Women were raped, men were executed, and children were left to fend for themselves amidst the devastation. The invasion of China was not just about territory. It was about control over resources, over people, over entire cultures. Japan, seeking to expand its empire and secure the raw materials it needed to fuel its military machine, had turned its sights on a nation that was already struggling to survive. China, a land of ancient history and proud civilization, was being reduced to rubble, its people subjected to unimaginable horrors. Yet, through the bloodshed and chaos, the Chinese resisted. They fought, not for a fleeting victory, but for survival. But Japan's ambitions did not stop in China. With an eye on Southeast Asia, the Japanese military turned its attention to a broader, more aggressive campaign. In 1940, Japan invaded French Indochina, and soon after, the Philippines, Burma, and Malaya felt the crushing weight of the imperial army. The Japanese forces were swift, their strategy calculated and ruthless. They captured island after island, each conquest bringing them closer to their ultimate goal, a vast and unified empire across the Pacific. The brutality of Japan's campaign left scars across the lands it touched. Cities were destroyed, families torn apart, and millions of lives were lost in the pursuit of imperial glory. The people of Southeast Asia, who had already endured the oppressive rule of European colonial powers, now faced the wrath of a new, equally merciless force. It was not just a war of conquest, it was a war of domination. Japan sought to enslave entire populations, using fear and terror as their tools. Entire cultures were crushed under the weight of an empire that knew no compassion. As Japan advanced, the world watched in horror. The United States, still reeling from the Great Depression, had hoped to remain uninvolved. But as Japan's empire expanded, it became increasingly difficult to ignore the mounting threat. Japan's war machine needed resources, and it turned to the Pacific to fuel its hunger. The United States, in an effort to curb Japan's expansion, imposed economic sanctions, cutting off vital supplies, particularly oil, to Japan. For Japan, this was more than just an obstacle, it was an act of war. The tension between Japan and the United States reached its boiling point. The leaders in Tokyo knew that they had to act quickly before their supply lines were completely severed. And so, in the early morning hours of December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy launched a surprise attack on the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In a matter of hours, the tranquil morning turned to chaos. Waves of Japanese bombers and fighters streaked across the sky, dropping bombs that shattered ships, destroyed planes, and left the waters stained with blood. The attack was devastating, but it was also a pivotal moment. The shock and disbelief that spread across the United States were palpable. It was no longer just a distant war, it was personal. The Pacific had become a battleground that would change the course of history. As the bombs fell, families across the Pacific world were torn apart. Men, women, and children, caught in the midst of a war that none of them had chosen, found themselves on the front lines. In China, Southeast Asia, and across the Pacific, the suffering intensified. For many, survival became the only goal. The cruel forces of war tore apart communities, leaving behind only memories of happier days and dreams of peace that seemed impossibly distant. The Japanese had set the world on fire, but the flames would not be easily extinguished. The United States, its resolve hardened by the attack on Pearl Harbor, would soon be joined by the Allies in a global struggle that would reshape the world forever. Japan's march through Asia would come to an end, but not before it had caused immense suffering and loss. The road to Pearl Harbor was paved with the blood and tears of millions, and its impact would resonate for generations to come. In the aftermath, the world would bear witness to the pain of those who had lived through it. The survivors, those who had fought and those who had been caught in the relentless march of war, would carry the scars of their experiences for the rest of their lives. And though the flames of conflict would eventually die down, the cost of Japan's expansion would never be forgotten. It was a cold morning on June 22, 1941, when the German war machine, the might of the Wehrmacht, began its brutal march toward the Soviet Union. A seemingly unstoppable force, the Nazis launched Operation Barbarossa, one of the largest military offensives the world had ever seen. In a split second, the course of history changed. A vast swath of Europe was set aflame as millions of soldiers, tanks, and planes surged toward the east, ready to overwhelm everything in their path. The Soviet Union was not prepared for the sheer ferocity of the attack that would come, and neither were the people who lived there. They had no idea that their world was about to be turned upside down. The early hours of the invasion were devastating. The German forces moved with terrifying speed and precision, smashing through Soviet defenses like a tidal wave. The ground shook with the thundering noise of tanks, and the sky was filled with the shriek of bombers dropping their deadly payloads. Soldiers on both sides fought tooth and nail, but the Germans quickly seized one city after another. The people of the Soviet Union, unprepared for this onslaught, were caught in the chaos. Whole villages were razed to the ground, and the once peaceful countryside became a battlefield. The heart of Russia was exposed, and the terror spread. For the German soldiers, it seemed like victory was inevitable. They had come to believe in the invincibility of their cause, and the early successes only reinforced this belief. Soviet towns were abandoned or overrun, and the Nazi war machine pushed relentlessly forward. The countryside that once held generations of families was now stained with blood and wreckage. The German troops, hungry for victory and revenge, showed no mercy. They advanced, seemingly invincible, with no thought for the families they were leaving behind. But the Soviets, despite the early losses, had something the Germans had not counted on: an unbreakable spirit. The people of the Soviet Union, from the highest-ranking officers to the smallest child, understood the gravity of the moment. They knew that their homeland, their families, and their way of life were at risk. Resistance began in every corner of the land, every town, every village, and every soldier. Despite the overwhelming odds, the Soviets refused to give up. In the face of relentless destruction, civilians took up arms. Men and women, farmers and factory workers, stood side by side, determined to push the invaders back. For them, the invasion wasn't just a military conflict, it was a fight for survival. The Germans had underestimated the resolve of the Soviet people. They had believed that a quick, decisive victory would end the war, but instead, they encountered a resistance that would only grow stronger with each passing day. The weather itself seemed to turn against the Germans. As the months wore on, the bitter Russian winter arrived with all its fury. The soldiers, once so confident, now found themselves struggling against freezing temperatures, inadequate supplies, and harsh conditions. The unforgiving cold seeped into their bones, making it nearly impossible to maintain the momentum they had once had. The vast Soviet landscape, filled with dense forests and endless plains, became a treacherous battleground where the soldiers could no longer count on speed or surprise. The German forces, who had once advanced with such confidence, were now bogged down, their equipment and morale suffering as they pushed deeper into the Soviet Union. But even in the darkest moments, the Soviet resistance never faltered. The people, who had witnessed the brutality of the invaders firsthand, fought back with every ounce of strength they had. They faced unimaginable horrors, yet they refused to surrender. The German forces were met with an increasingly determined and relentless enemy, unwilling to let their land be taken. The Soviet soldiers dug in, fought hard, and refused to retreat. The early German victories began to feel like hollow triumphs, as they quickly realized that victory would not come easily. The people of the Soviet Union, despite all the pain, loss, and suffering they endured, held on to the hope that they could drive the invaders out. They fought for their families, for their cities, and for the very essence of their nation. With every battle, every sacrifice, the determination of the Soviet people grew. The Germans, once so confident in their ability to crush the resistance, now faced a war of attrition that they were ill-prepared for. The tides began to turn. What had seemed like an unstoppable force was now being pushed back. The Soviet counterattacks were fierce and determined, and the German soldiers found themselves in a brutal and relentless struggle for survival. The invasion of the Soviet Union, which had started with such overwhelming force, now faced an equally formidable opposition. The ground that had once been covered with the wreckage of cities now became the site of fierce battles. What had once been a dream of conquest had now turned into a nightmare for the invaders. In the end, the German invasion of the Soviet Union failed, but not without cost. The pain and suffering endured by both sides would be etched into the memories of those who lived through it for the rest of their lives. Families were torn apart, homes were destroyed, and the land was scarred beyond recognition. The Soviet people, battered and bruised, had managed to turn the tide of war. But at what cost? The cost of the German invasion of the Soviet Union was not just measured in the number of lives lost, but in the enduring spirit of resistance, the sacrifices made, and the will to survive against impossible odds. Operation Barbarossa, once thought to be the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union, instead became the turning point in the war. The German advance, so swift and devastating in the beginning, faltered in the face of a resilient enemy. The Eastern Front, which had once seemed like a distant theater of war, would now become the heart of the conflict. The battle was far from over, but the Soviets had shown that no force, no matter how powerful, could easily break their will to fight for their homeland. The sun was just beginning to rise on a quiet Sunday morning in Hawaii when the skies darkened with the roar of planes. It was December 7, 1941, a day that would live in infamy. The world, already engulfed in a war that had taken millions of lives, was about to change once more. In a calculated, ruthless attack, Japanese forces descended on the United States Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, unleashing a wave of destruction. In the blink of an eye, lives were lost, ships were sunk, and the future of the world shifted forever. For the people of the United States, the sense of safety they had felt from the war raging overseas was shattered. As the bombs fell from the sky, chaos erupted. The once peaceful harbor, a symbol of American power and pride, was transformed into a battlefield. The sounds of explosions and the screams of soldiers and sailors filled the air. Wildfires raged, and ships that had been anchored for years were now sinking beneath the waves. The air was thick with smoke, and the sky was a sickening shade of black. Amid the devastation, there was a deep sense of disbelief. How could this happen? How could the mighty United States be attacked on its own soil? For the men and women stationed at Pearl Harbor, the attack was a nightmare they could never have imagined. In a matter of hours, they had lost friends, comrades, and colleagues. They had watched their ships burn, their planes destroyed, and their homes turned into ruins. The pain was not just physical, it was emotional and psychological. The shock of such a sudden and brutal attack was something that no one had been prepared for. The realization set in that the United States could no longer remain distant from the war. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not just a blow to the military, it was a direct assault on the American spirit. In Washington, D.C., the news of the attack sent shockwaves through the government. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, gripped by the enormity of the loss, stood before Congress the next day. With a steady voice, he declared war on Japan, delivering a speech that would be remembered for generations. His words were not just a call to arms, they were a rallying cry for the entire nation. A date which will live in infamy, he said, and in those words, the resolve of the American people was sealed. The United States, once a reluctant participant in the global conflict, was now fully engaged in the fight. As the news spread across the nation, a deep sense of grief and anger swept through the American people. They mourned the loss of their soldiers, sailors, and civilians, but they also felt a surge of determination. The attack on Pearl Harbor had ignited a fire in their hearts. There was no turning back now. The United States would rise up, not just to avenge the attack, but to put an end to the tyranny that was spreading across the globe. The horrors of war were no longer something happening on distant shores, they were personal. The Pacific War had begun. In the days that followed, Americans across the country enlisted in the military, eager to serve their country and take the fight to the enemy. The feeling of unity was overwhelming. Men and women, young and old, from all walks of life, joined the ranks. It was as if a national identity had been forged in the fires of Pearl Harbor. Everyone, regardless of background, had a role to play. The desire to protect their homes, their families, and their way of life fueled an unwavering commitment to victory. The war had come to them, and now they would make sure it would be their enemy who would be defeated. For the soldiers who would soon face the Japanese forces in the Pacific, the memories of Pearl Harbor were raw and painful. They knew that the fight would be long and brutal. The Pacific was vast, and the Japanese military was formidable. But the men who donned their uniforms were not deterred by the challenge ahead. They carried with them the weight of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the faces of the fallen, and the hope that they could bring an end to the suffering. The images of the burning ships, the sinking planes, and the bodies of their comrades would stay with them for the rest of their lives, propelling them forward as they took to the battlefield. As the war in the Pacific raged on, the American people never forgot the cost of Pearl Harbor. It was a constant reminder of what they had lost and what they stood to gain. The resolve to defeat Japan, to avenge the lives lost that day, became a driving force for every soldier who fought in the Pacific. The battle was not just one of military strategy, it was a deeply personal one. Each victory, each inch of ground gained, was a tribute to the lives lost at Pearl Harbor. Every victory in the Pacific was a step closer to justice for those who had died. The attack on Pearl Harbor had united a nation in grief, but it also united them in purpose. The pain and anger of that day, though heartbreaking, spurred the United States to become the global power it would become in the years to follow. The nation was no longer just a bystander, it was an active participant in shaping the future of the world. The Pacific War had begun, and with it, the United States would never be the same again. For the soldiers who fought in the Pacific, the memories of Pearl Harbor would never fade. It was a reminder that war was not just about politics or strategy, it was about real people, real lives, and the sacrifices they made for the greater good. The battle for the Pacific would test them in ways they could never have anticipated. But it was the memory of that fateful day in December, when everything changed, that would carry them through the darkest days of the war. The sea was vast, endless, stretching out in every direction. But it wasn't calm. Beneath the waves, a deadly cat-and-mouse game was unfolding, unseen by those on the surface. The Battle of the Atlantic was a fight that never ceased, a fight where one mistake could mean the difference between life and death. Convoys of merchant ships, loaded with vital supplies, were constantly on the move, escorted by warships to keep them safe. Their mission was simple: to deliver the goods that would keep the Allied war effort alive. But lurking beneath the waves were the German U-boats, silent and deadly, hunting for their prey. The crews of the merchant ships had no idea what waited for them, no way of knowing which night would be their last. The U-boats, designed to sneak through the darkness of the ocean, were like ghosts. They would emerge from the depths, launch their torpedoes, and disappear just as quickly, leaving nothing but a trail of wreckage and drowning men in their wake. Each convoy crossing the Atlantic was a gamble, a roll of the dice. Some ships would make it through, their precious cargo untouched. But far too many would never reach their destination. The cries of the men trapped in the sinking ships echoed in the cold, dark water, swallowed by the ocean. For the sailors aboard the ships, there was no peace, no time to relax. Every day was spent looking over their shoulders, listening for the sounds of an explosion, waiting for the rumble of an impact. They knew that every moment at sea brought them closer to death. Some never saw it coming. One moment, they were sailing peacefully; the next, the world erupted into chaos as an explosion rocked the hull, sending men scrambling for their lives. In those moments, time seemed to slow. Everything felt as if it was happening in a dream, yet it was all too real. The cold salt water rushed up around them, and the terrifying thought would always be the same: would I survive this? Would I see my family again? The U-boats were ruthless in their pursuit. Their captains, hardened by the harsh realities of war, knew no mercy. Each torpedo launched was not just a military tactic, it was an act of desperation, a plea for survival in a war that seemed endless. They, too, fought for their homes, their families, and their very way of life. But the men aboard the convoys fought for something even larger, a future free from tyranny, a world where the light of freedom would never go out. But that hope was always just out of reach, as each sinking ship brought them one step closer to defeat. The convoys, though, were not without their protectors. The Royal Navy, with its relentless determination, kept a close watch over the ocean. The warships circled, scanning the horizon for the telltale signs of an attack. They knew that if they failed, the world would fall deeper into darkness. They fought to keep the supply lines open, knowing that each victory at sea would bring the Allies closer to defeating the enemy. Every time a German U-boat was sunk, it felt like a small victory against the endless tide of death. But there were still too many, and each loss made it clear just how high the stakes were. The sound of warplanes overhead would offer a brief, though never certain, sense of relief. When aircraft arrived to assist in the hunt for U-boats, there was a flicker of hope that they might just drive the submarines away, but this hope was fragile. The U-boats could dive deep, disappearing into the vastness of the ocean, only to surface again at a moment's notice. It was a constant game of hide and seek, one that would continue until the war's end. The sea seemed indifferent to the violence above. The water, so calm and vast, hid the destruction beneath. The survivors of the wrecks knew the ocean's mercilessness all too well. For many, their shipmates were lost in the blink of an eye, swallowed by the abyss. The wrecks of ships sank slowly, as though even the sea itself hesitated to take them, giving one last chance for men to escape. Some would, but many would never make it to the lifeboats. Their bodies would be carried away, their names forgotten by all but the ocean. It was a grim reminder of the fragility of life and the brutal reality of war. For the families waiting back home, the fear was constant. The telegrams that arrived with the news of a lost ship, a lost son, husband, or father, shattered lives. The families never knew if their loved ones were among the fortunate survivors or if they had been consumed by the sea. The wait was agonizing, endless. They watched the news, read the papers, prayed for a miracle. But for too many, that miracle never came. The ocean, vast and endless, claimed more lives than anyone could count, and the heartbreak carried on long after the war ended. But there were also stories of survival. For the men who made it through the Battle of the Atlantic, the sense of camaraderie, of shared experience, ran deep. They had been through hell together, faced death at every turn, and somehow emerged on the other side. The feeling of being alive, of having made it through the storm, was a feeling they would carry with them forever. The men who had fought through the darkest depths of the sea had seen horrors beyond imagination, but they had also seen the resilience of the human spirit. It was a resilience that kept them fighting, kept them moving forward, no matter how many of their comrades were lost along the way. The Battle of the Atlantic was not just a battle for control of the sea, it was a battle for survival, for the future, for the hope that freedom would prevail. The men who fought on the convoys and aboard the U-boats knew that their struggle was a small part of something much larger, something that would change the world forever. The ocean may have been their battleground, but it was also their witness. And though the war would eventually come to an end, the memories of those days, the ships, the submarines, the endless waves of fear and courage, would remain etched in their hearts for as long as they lived. The fate of the world hung by a thread. 3 men, each carrying the hopes of millions, sat together, their faces etched with the weight of responsibility. Their words would shape the course of history, their decisions would determine the future of nations, and their alliance, born out of necessity, would hold the power to change the very fabric of the world. In one room, at the height of the war, were Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, leaders who, despite their vast differences, found common ground in the shared horror of the conflict. Roosevelt, the calm and calculating president of the United States, had already witnessed the toll the war had taken on his country and knew that only by uniting the world could the Axis powers be stopped. Churchill, the indomitable British Prime Minister, had faced the might of Hitler's forces and knew that Britain's survival depended not just on fighting alone but on forging new alliances, no matter how unlikely. And then there was Stalin, the ruler of the Soviet Union, whose own people had already paid an unbearable price in blood. His country was reeling from invasion, with the German war machine pressing ever closer to the heart of his empire. It was in these dark days that they came together, driven by a single, shared belief: if they did not act as one, the world would fall under the shadow of tyranny. They set aside their differences, their distrust, and their personal ambitions, and focused instead on one goal: victory. The fate of humanity rested in their hands, and they knew it. The strategy sessions were not easy. Roosevelt, with his characteristic optimism and strategic mind, was keen on ensuring that the Allies could secure the resources they needed to win. He knew the United States had the strength to tip the scales, but only if Britain and the Soviet Union could hold on. Churchill, never one to shy away from a challenge, argued fiercely for the necessity of a Western Front, an invasion of Europe that would force Germany to fight on 2 fronts. But Stalin, whose country was already bearing the brunt of the war on the Eastern Front, insisted that the primary effort must be focused on the Soviet struggle, believing that the bloodshed his people had already endured should not be forgotten or ignored. The discussions were tense. Roosevelt and Churchill had to assure Stalin that they would commit to a second front, an invasion of Western Europe, to relieve the pressure on the Soviet Union. Stalin, in turn, had to trust that the Western powers would follow through on their promises. There was no room for doubt. Every hesitation could mean more lives lost, more suffering endured. Despite the tensions, the gravity of the situation forced them to work together. Each leader knew the stakes. Roosevelt had already seen the toll the war had taken on his people, and his decisions weighed heavily on him. He had to ensure that American forces were not just engaged in the war but committed to a global strategy that could defeat the Axis powers on all fronts. For Churchill, every decision was a matter of survival. Britain was hanging on by a thread, fighting alone in the early years of the war. His country was on the brink of collapse, and yet he refused to surrender. The British spirit, he knew, could not be broken, but it needed help. Stalin's situation was the most desperate. The German army was within striking distance of Moscow, and his soldiers were dying in the millions. He needed help, and he needed it now. The three leaders knew that their personal animosities and differences could not get in the way. They were fighting not for national glory, but for the survival of all free peoples. There was a deep understanding between them, a silent agreement that no matter the cost, they would carry on. Roosevelt's calm demeanor and steady hand guided the conversations. Churchill's impassioned speeches rallied those in the room, urging them not to give up. Stalin's steely resolve made it clear that his people had already paid too high a price for them to falter now. Behind the closed doors of their meetings, with the weight of millions of lives hanging in the balance, they formed a bond forged not in friendship but in the dire need for victory. There was no time for ego, no space for petty grievances. They spoke candidly, sometimes sharply, but always with the knowledge that only together could they win. It was not just a military alliance, it was a meeting of minds, a meeting of desperate souls who knew that their unity would determine the future of the world. In those hours of planning, the leaders discussed more than just strategy. They spoke of the future, the kind of world they wanted to build once the war was over. Roosevelt, with his vision for a peaceful world, spoke of the importance of international cooperation. Churchill, with his pride for his country, spoke of defending liberty and the values that Britain held dear. Stalin, whose country had been torn apart by the war, spoke of securing the Soviet Union's place in the post-war world. Each man had his vision, his dream, and while they did not always agree, they understood that they needed to set aside those differences to ensure victory. The discussions were exhausting. The pressure was suffocating. But in the end, they emerged with a clear path forward. The Allied strategy, designed to stretch the Axis forces thin and attack on multiple fronts, would carry on. The invasion of Normandy would eventually come, as would the relentless push from the Soviets on the Eastern Front. These combined efforts would force the Axis to fight on all sides, weakening them until their forces could no longer withstand the pressure. In those meetings, history was written. It was written not in books or speeches, but in the hearts of those men who understood the magnitude of their decisions. Each word they spoke carried the weight of lives lost, of homes destroyed, of hopes dashed. But there was also a glimmer of hope in the darkest hours. The grand alliance they formed was not just a military strategy, it was a lifeline for the world. It was a testament to the power of unity in the face of unimaginable adversity. They had come together not out of choice, but out of necessity. And it was that necessity that would carry them, and the world, through to victory. The sun hung heavy in the sky, casting a burning glare across the Pacific. The hum of military engines echoed through the air as a storm of violence brewed. On the ground, the tension was suffocating, and the air felt thick with fear. For the soldiers stationed in the Philippines, Singapore, and other parts of Southeast Asia, the nightmare was just beginning. Japan's war machine was relentless. The rapid fall of the Philippines seemed like a terrible omen, a cruel sign of what was to come for the nations unlucky enough to be in Japan's path. The soldiers stationed there had no idea what was coming when the Japanese forces launched their surprise attacks. The bombing of Pearl Harbor had been the spark, but what followed was a fury of destruction that spread like wildfire. Japan's army, having already taken Manchuria and parts of China, now turned its eyes toward Southeast Asia. As the Japanese forces stormed the Philippines, those who had been waiting for a miracle found none. The troops stationed there fought bravely, knowing full well they were outmatched, outnumbered, and without enough supplies to sustain them. The desperate calls for reinforcements went unanswered as the Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly between the islands and the distant American mainland. For the Filipino and American soldiers, surrender seemed like an inevitable outcome. It wasn't just a loss of territory, it was a loss of hope. The fall of the Philippines marked a turning point, and the devastation of the Bataan Death March would haunt the hearts of those who survived it, their bodies broken and spirits shattered. The Japanese were swift and brutal. The fall of Singapore came next, and with it, the symbol of British power in the East crumbled. For the British soldiers, the humiliation was unbearable. They had once ruled this part of the world, but now their empire lay in tatters, the once proud fortress of Singapore falling within days of the Japanese invasion. There were no triumphs for the defenders, only despair and surrender. Families were separated, and hopes were dashed. The survivors carried the scars of that loss for the rest of their lives, their dreams of glory shattered by the overwhelming force of the Japanese army. The island of Singapore became a place where the unthinkable happened, where soldiers, once filled with pride and duty, were now prisoners of war. The Japanese did not show mercy. For those who were captured, the horrors of what lay ahead would be far worse than they had ever imagined. Their dignity stripped away, their bodies ravaged by hunger, thirst, and disease, they endured unimaginable hardships. The images of Singapore's fall would stay with the world for years to come, a haunting reminder of how quickly things could change, how power could slip through one's fingers like sand. Meanwhile, as Japan extended its grip on the Pacific, its victories seemed unstoppable. The speed at which they conquered, the precision of their strategy, it was almost as though they were invincible. The world looked on in disbelief as they swept across the South Pacific, crushing all in their path. The sound of their planes roaring overhead became a constant reminder that there was nowhere safe. For those living on the islands, life became a grim routine of survival, hiding from the ever-present threat above. In the hearts of those living under Japanese occupation, there was a silent understanding. No one knew when or where it would end, but everyone knew that this was not just a war for land, it was a war for their very existence. With each passing day, the hope that someone would come to their rescue faded. The realization sank in, they were alone, and the fight to survive had just begun. Yet, in the darkest hours, something powerful began to stir. It was a spirit that could not be crushed by bombs or brutality. Even as Japan's forces surged forward, there were those who refused to bow their heads, those who fought on against impossible odds. It wasn't just the soldiers on the front lines, but the civilians who quietly resisted, who sabotaged the enemy in small ways, whose courage burned quietly in the night. In the Philippines, even after the fall, the fire of resistance remained. The shadows of war were long, and there were those who refused to allow their homes to be erased from history. The guerrilla fighters, with nothing but their wits and the jungle to hide them, became symbols of defiance. And in Singapore, though the city had fallen, the British and their allies began to rebuild their hopes, knowing that this war was far from over. But for those who lived through those early days of Japanese dominance, the pain, the loss, and the heartbreak were etched into their memories forever. The cries of the wounded, the burning villages, the feeling of helplessness, those things could never be forgotten. The world would later hear the stories of their suffering, but no words could truly capture the horror of those times. The men and women who lived through it could only carry the scars, each one a reminder of the darkness that had once seemed endless. But even in the midst of this, the resolve of nations would not break. Japan's victories, though significant, were not permanent. They had only unleashed a fury that would soon return upon them. The early victories seemed to promise a swift end to the war, but as quickly as Japan had advanced, the world began to regroup. The tides were turning. The spirit of those who had endured the horrors of the Japanese advance would not be silenced, and slowly, the shadows of fear began to recede. For the soldiers who fought in the Philippines, Singapore, and the other islands across the Pacific, the memories of those early days would stay with them forever. The pain of loss, the silence that followed the sounds of battle, the realization that survival was no longer a guarantee, they would carry those moments with them for the rest of their lives. It wasn't just about defeating an enemy, it was about reclaiming their dignity, their homes, and their futures. And though it seemed impossible at the time, the war was far from over. The storm that had engulfed the Pacific would soon meet its match, and the strength of those who had endured would become part of the unstoppable force that would bring about Japan's downfall. The ground trembled with the weight of war. The roar of explosions was so constant it became part of the air itself. For the men fighting in Stalingrad, it wasn't just a battle, it was survival, minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day. The city had become a wasteland, its buildings reduced to rubble, its streets nothing more than a maze of death. Yet, amid this hell, the will to resist burned brighter than ever. For the German soldiers, advancing into Stalingrad felt like the final push to victory. The city, named after their enemy's leader, was the last major obstacle between them and their dream of a complete conquest of the Soviet Union. The air was thick with hope, mixed with arrogance. They were confident, so sure of their superiority, so convinced that they would crush the Soviets and claim the city in a matter of days. They never expected that the enemy would stand so firm, that they would fight with such desperation. The Soviet soldiers, battered and scarred from years of brutal fighting, were prepared to die in Stalingrad. They had already lost so much. Their comrades, their homes, their families, everything had been taken from them. Now, they had one thing left, the city, the last stronghold in their land that had not yet fallen to the Germans. If Stalingrad fell, so would the heart of the Soviet Union. The city was not just bricks and mortar, it was everything they had left. The men in the trenches knew it. This wasn't just about military strategy, it was about defending their very identity. The battle was fought in the ruins, on streets that had once been full of life, but were now littered with the bodies of the fallen. There was no place to hide. The Germans advanced, hoping to outflank the Soviets, but the Soviets fought back, using every corner, every crumbled building as their defense. They turned Stalingrad into a death trap, where no one was safe, neither the soldiers nor the civilians who had been left behind. The once thriving city was now a barren landscape of destruction, and every inch was a battleground. The fighting was vicious. It was close-quarters combat, with men fighting not just with weapons, but with their fists, their teeth, their very souls. The Germans thought they were invincible, but the Soviets fought with a ferocity that was born out of desperation. They had nothing left to lose but their homeland, and they would not give it up easily. For every German soldier who fell, 10 more would take his place, determined to bring the city to its knees. But for every Soviet soldier who fell, there were more who would rise from the ashes, unwilling to surrender, unwilling to abandon their city. The winter air was bitter, and the men on both sides were freezing, their clothing stiff with the cold. The blood of the fallen froze into the ground, mixing with the dirt and dust of war. As the battle dragged on, the city became a ghost town, filled with the sounds of the wounded and dying. But the German forces were not prepared for what lay ahead. The Soviet army, in a masterstroke of strategy, encircled the Germans. They had been trapped, surrounded by an army that had been written off as defeated. The winter that had once seemed like an enemy to the Soviets had now become their ally, freezing the German supply lines, leaving them stranded and desperate. In the freezing cold, the German soldiers began to starve. Supplies ran low. Their hope began to crumble as fast as the buildings around them. What had seemed like an easy victory was slipping through their fingers. The men who had marched proudly into Stalingrad now found themselves trapped in a nightmare, surrounded by an enemy they had underestimated. The battle, which had begun with such confidence, had turned into a bloody, unrelenting struggle for survival. For the Germans, it was a humiliation they could not have imagined. They had come to conquer, but instead, they were being destroyed, piece by piece. The Germans had overestimated their strength and underestimated the resolve of the Soviets. The Soviet army, battered and scarred, had turned the tide of the battle, pushing the Germans back, inch by inch. What had started as an invasion had turned into a retreat, a flight from the very city they had believed would be their triumph. In the end, the battle became not just a military victory, but a symbol of the Soviet resilience. The Germans had underestimated their enemy, thinking they were weak, but they had never understood the power of a people who had nothing left to lose. The Soviet soldiers fought not just for their country, but for their very survival, and in the end, it was this unyielding spirit that led them to victory. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad was not just a turning point in the war, it was a testament to the human spirit. The price had been unimaginable. Thousands of lives lost, cities destroyed, families torn apart. But through all the suffering, through all the pain, the Soviets had won. They had stood firm against an overwhelming force, and against all odds, they had triumphed. For the Germans, Stalingrad was a crushing defeat. It was a blow to their pride, to their confidence, and to their belief that they were invincible. The once proud army had been humbled, and the Soviet Union had proven that it would not fall, no matter how hard the enemy tried. For the men who fought in the streets of Stalingrad, for the soldiers who fought through the rubble, for the civilians who suffered in silence, this battle would live on in their memories forever. It was a fight that had cost them everything, but in the end, it had given them something even more powerful, the knowledge that no matter how dire the situation, there was always hope, always the possibility of a future. Stalingrad had shown them that the human spirit could not be broken, even in the face of unimaginable odds. The sun beat down mercilessly on the desert, casting a golden haze over the battlefield. For months, the sound of artillery fire, the rumble of tanks, and the cries of soldiers had filled the dry air. It was a battle not just for land, but for survival. The sands of North Africa had become the site of one of the fiercest struggles in World War II, a place where heroes were born and countless lives were lost. Rommel, the Desert Fox, had carved out a reputation as one of the most brilliant military minds in the world. His swift victories in North Africa had terrified the Allies, and his forces had pushed ever further into Egypt, threatening the Suez Canal and cutting off vital supply lines. His troops, hardened by months of desert warfare, seemed unstoppable. But the Allies were not about to surrender so easily. The battle was far from over. In the heat of the desert, the tension was unbearable. The Allies had suffered setback after setback, their forces stretched thin, their supply lines threatened. But the winds of change were beginning to blow. The moment that had seemed so far away, the moment of resistance, had finally arrived. The desert, which had once been the stage for Rommel's triumphs, now became the place where the tides of war began to turn. The Battle of El Alamein marked the beginning of the end for the Axis in North Africa. The Allies, under the command of General Bernard Montgomery, stood their ground against Rommel's forces, knowing that this battle was not just about military strategy. It was about the survival of a world that had been plunged into darkness. Montgomery's men fought with everything they had. They knew that failure would mean the fall of Egypt, the loss of the Suez Canal, and possibly the entire Middle East. The stakes were high, and there was no turning back. As the battle raged on, the air was filled with the sound of gunfire, the pounding of tanks, and the constant explosions that shook the earth beneath their feet. The heat was unbearable, the dust choking. But the soldiers fought on, driven by a deep sense of purpose, by the knowledge that they were not just fighting for victory, but for their families, for their countries, for their freedom. Every inch of ground was hard-won, and no one knew who would emerge victorious. In the face of mounting pressure, Rommel's forces began to falter. The German supply lines, stretched thin and cut off by the Allied forces, were unable to keep up with the demands of war. Supplies of food, ammunition, and fuel dwindled, leaving the Desert Fox's army struggling to maintain their position. The desert, once their ally, had become a harsh and unforgiving enemy. The very sands that had once hidden their movements now betrayed them, as the Allies launched a series of devastating counterattacks. The turning point came with a series of attacks on the German flanks. The Allies, who had once been on the defensive, now took the offensive. Rommel, a master of desert warfare, found himself caught in a trap of his own making. His army, stretched too thin, began to crumble. The once feared Desert Fox was now forced to retreat. His defeat at El Alamein marked a stunning reversal of fortune, and the Axis forces in North Africa began to withdraw. As Rommel's forces retreated, the desert echoed with the sound of retreating footsteps, the very symbol of the shifting tides of war. The battle for North Africa was far from over, but the Allies had gained the upper hand. The road to Tunisia was now open, and with it came the promise of victory, the promise of an end to the Axis presence in Africa. But the retreat of the Axis was not without its cost. The desert had taken its toll on both sides. Thousands of soldiers had fallen in the brutal fighting, and the scars of war were etched deeply into the land. The struggle for control of North Africa had been a bitter one, and the battles had left both sides exhausted. But even in the face of such loss, there was hope. The Allies had proven that they could stand firm, that they could push back against the might of the Axis forces, and that they could fight with the determination needed to win. As the Axis forces withdrew, the Allies continued their advance toward Tunisia. The desert, once a place of fear and defeat, had become a symbol of hope. It was here that the Allied forces, led by Montgomery and others, would strike the final blow to the Axis forces in Africa. The German and Italian armies, unable to sustain their positions any longer, began to crumble under the pressure. The retreat from North Africa was a blow to the Axis powers and a victory for the Allied forces. For the men who had fought in the deserts of North Africa, for the soldiers who had fought in the blistering heat and choking dust, the victory at El Alamein and the retreat of Rommel were moments that would stay with them forever. They had faced the worst of what war had to offer, and they had emerged victorious. They had witnessed the cost of war, the loss of comrades, the destruction of cities, the heartbreak of battle, but they had also seen the power of determination, the strength of unity, and the unyielding spirit of those who refused to give up. The fall of Rommel and the Axis retreat from Africa was not just a military victory, it was a victory for the spirit of those who fought. It was a victory for every soldier who had fought in the heat of the desert, for every civilian who had lived in the shadow of war. And as the Allies pushed forward, their victory in North Africa would pave the way for future battles, for the defeat of the Axis powers, and for a world that had finally begun to see the light at the end of the tunnel. The morning sky over Midway was eerily calm, a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding below. The Pacific Ocean, vast and unyielding, seemed like an endless stretch of blue. But under that calm surface, beneath the waves and clouds, a storm was brewing, one that would change the course of the war. The battle had begun, and for the United States, it felt like a last stand. The Japanese Empire, with its swift and brutal attacks, had been on the offensive for months. From Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, it had seemed like nothing could slow their advance. The world watched in fear, helpless as the Axis powers stretched their dominance across the Pacific. But there, at Midway, a glimmer of hope flickered. This was their moment, an opportunity to turn the tide. The Japanese fleet, massive and powerful, came charging toward the small American outpost of Midway, its eyes set on the final destruction of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific. Their plan was simple: overwhelm, strike swiftly, and crush the American forces. But what they didn't count on was the courage and resolve of those who stood against them. The American pilots, the crews, the commanders, each one with a heart full of fear, but even more filled with defiance. In the heart of the storm, American intelligence had cracked the Japanese code. They knew the enemy was coming. They had time to prepare, and they made it count. The planes took off from Midway's runways, the engines roaring into the air. The men behind the controls were young, many of them only barely old enough to shave, but they carried the weight of their nations on their shoulders. Every man knew the risks. It was all or nothing. The Japanese bombers, poised to strike Midway itself, had no idea what was about to hit them. As the battle unfolded, the first wave of American planes, led by brave pilots, attacked the heart of the Japanese fleet. The odds were insurmountable, and yet, against all expectation, they fought back with everything they had. The sound of gunfire and explosions filled the sky as American bombers and fighters engaged their enemies in a desperate struggle for survival. Then came the moment that would forever be etched into history. American dive bombers, flying through a storm of enemy fire, spotted the Japanese carriers. The bombers, knowing they only had one chance, swooped in, their bombs falling through the sky like a storm of vengeance. One by one, the bombs struck their targets. The mighty Japanese carriers, symbols of their power, shuddered and burned, sinking into the ocean depths. The roar of victory, the taste of triumph, was a bittersweet echo in the air. But the victory came at a steep cost. The Japanese had fought fiercely, their determination unshaken, and they weren't going to go down easily. The battle raged on, with fighters spiraling through the air, tearing through the sky in a deadly dance. Yet, despite their fierce resistance, the Japanese had underestimated the resolve of the Americans. The sheer will to fight, to protect their homes, to protect their loved ones, was something that could not be easily broken. As the smoke cleared and the waves settled, the once proud Japanese fleet lay broken, its carriers and ships destroyed. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted. The victory at Midway was not just a tactical win, it was the moment when the momentum in the Pacific War turned. Japan, which had once seemed unstoppable, was now reeling from the blow. Their naval strength, once unmatched, had been dealt a crushing blow, and they were no longer the unstoppable force they once seemed to be. For the men who fought at Midway, it was a moment of intense emotion. The fear of facing an enemy who had already inflicted so much pain was real. The losses of comrades, the uncertainty of survival, weighed heavy on their hearts. But there, in the heat of battle, they found something stronger than fear, courage, brotherhood, and a fierce will to win. They had fought for their homes, for their families, and for a world that had been torn apart by war. And in the heart of the Pacific, they had won. They had shown the world that the tide could be turned. As the dust settled over Midway, as the waves lapped gently against the shore, the men who had survived looked out at the horizon. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. The losses, the sacrifices, would never be forgotten. The sailors and pilots who had fought so bravely had lived through the unimaginable, and in doing so, they had given the world a chance at peace. The Battle of Midway was more than just a military victory, it was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Against overwhelming odds, the men of the U.S. Navy had fought back. They had stood their ground, and in doing so, they had changed the course of the war. Their victory at Midway would echo through the pages of history, a symbol of hope in the face of darkness. For those who were there, the battle would always be a part of them. The faces of the men they had lost, the roar of engines, the thundering explosions, they would never forget. But neither would they forget the moment when they had stood together, against all odds, and proven that the light could never be extinguished. In the end, they had not only defended their country, but they had defended the very idea of freedom itself. The sun beat down relentlessly on the Sicilian coast as the first waves of soldiers, soaked in sweat and determination, landed on the beaches. It was July 9, 1943, and the world held its breath. This wasn't just an invasion, it was the start of something monumental. The Allies had set their sights on Italy, the soft underbelly of the Axis powers. But for the men landing on those shores, it was much more than strategy. It was about taking the fight to the heart of Mussolini's regime. The air was thick with tension. The roar of engines, the crash of waves, and the rapid pounding of hearts mixed with the distant thud of gunfire. Soldiers, with faces full of resolve, waded through the surf, their boots sinking into the sand as they charged forward, not knowing what awaited them on the other side. These were men who had already seen too much death, but now they were fighting for something greater, the hope of liberating a country from the clutches of tyranny. The beaches of Sicily, initially calm, soon became a battleground. The cries of the wounded, the desperate orders shouted over the din of battle, and the sharp sounds of gunfire rang through the air. But even as the smoke of combat choked the horizon, there was a flicker of something more, something that had been missing for years. It was hope. The very hope that had been suffocated under the heel of fascism for so long was now beginning to rise again. As the Allies pushed deeper into Sicily, the weight of history seemed to press down on them. They weren't just fighting for a piece of land, they were fighting for a future where people could live free from fear. And with every inch they gained, they weren't just bringing themselves closer to victory, they were bringing that future closer as well. But the battles were far from easy. Mussolini's forces, though crumbling under the pressure, were not about to give up without a fierce fight. The roads and hills of Sicily became a deadly maze where the Allies had to face not just the enemy, but the very environment itself. Heat, exhaustion, and hunger took their toll. Soldiers had to dig deep into their training, into their courage, and sometimes into their very souls. But as the days passed and the Italian defenses began to crack, there was no turning back. Then came the turning point. On July 25th, Mussolini, the man who had once led Italy with an iron fist, was toppled. His government fell like a house of cards, shaken by the very forces he had once vowed to control. It was a victory, but it was one that felt more like a breath of relief than a true moment of celebration. Mussolini, who had once paraded through the streets in victory, was now a man on the run. As the Allies marched through Sicily and onto the mainland, the Italian people watched in a mix of fear and hope. For many, Mussolini's fall had been the light at the end of a long, dark tunnel. But there was also the fear of what would come next. The war was far from over, and the reality of living under occupation, with the constant threat of retribution from both the Axis and the Allies, weighed heavily on their minds. And yet, as the Allies pushed through Italy, one city after another fell. Naples was liberated. Rome was liberated. The Italian people, once trapped under the weight of fascism, began to feel the first stirrings of freedom. The air seemed to change. The smell of fresh bread, the sound of laughter in the streets, and the faces of ordinary Italians who had suffered for so long now seemed to hold a new sense of hope. There was a collective sigh of relief, as if the very earth itself was breathing again. But the war was far from over. Even with Mussolini's fall, the Italian resistance was not complete. The Allies faced fierce opposition from Nazi forces who had entrenched themselves in Italy, unwilling to give up without a fight. And as the battle for Italy raged on, it became clear that the road to peace would not come easily. For the soldiers fighting in Italy, the battles were often brutal and unforgiving. The mountains, the forests, the cities, they all became deadly traps. And with every victory, there was always the shadow of loss. Men who had fought side by side, who had shared dreams of a better world, now lay silent on the ground. Their comrades, though, would never forget them. They carried their memories, their sacrifices, with them into every new fight. Then came September 8th, the day Italy formally surrendered. For many Italians, it was the end of a nightmare. But for those who had been on the front lines, it was also the beginning of another struggle. The Germans, who had now entrenched themselves in Italy, fought back fiercely. But despite the horrors that followed, the collapse of Mussolini's regime was a turning point. Italy, once a proud fascist nation, was now free from the grip of tyranny. For the soldiers who had fought to bring Italy to its knees, the moments of victory were bittersweet. They had liberated a country, but they had lost so much along the way. The names of those who had fallen in battle would never be forgotten. The pain, the suffering, the cries of those who had been caught in the crossfire of war, it would stay with them forever. And yet, amid the ruins and the rubble, there was something more. There was the knowledge that, despite everything, they had fought for something worth fighting for. They had fought for freedom, for dignity, for a future where the shadows of war would no longer darken the earth. The Italian campaign had been one of the most grueling and challenging operations of the war. But it was also one of the most important. It marked the beginning of the end for Mussolini's reign and the liberation of millions of Italians from the grip of fascism. It was a campaign that cost lives, but it was also one that sparked hope. And for the people of Italy, it was a new dawn, one that promised that, no matter how dark the days before had been, the light of freedom was finally shining through. The sky over Germany was calm before it was shattered by the roar of engines. The night was dark, with only the faint glow of distant stars piercing through the endless black. But then, like a distant storm rolling in, the sound of planes filled the air, growing louder and louder until it was deafening. The people on the ground, already living in the shadow of war, knew what was coming. They looked up, dread in their hearts, as the first bombs began to fall. This was the Allied bombing campaign, a relentless effort to cripple Germany's industrial might and break the backbone of its war machine. Factories, railroads, and oil refineries, all were targeted in an effort to weaken the Nazi regime. But the bombs didn't just fall on steel and concrete. They fell on cities filled with people, families huddled together in basements, hoping against hope that they would survive the night. For those in the planes high above, the mission was clear. They were soldiers, carrying out orders in the name of victory. But as they flew over cities like Dresden, Hamburg, and Berlin, they could see the fires raging below, spreading through homes and lives. Each explosion lit up the sky, a brief flash of orange and red, followed by a cloud of smoke that rose like a ghost into the night. The destruction was unimaginable, and yet it was necessary, a hard, cold reality of war. On the ground, the experience was a nightmare that never seemed to end. Air raid sirens would scream through the streets, sending people racing for cover. Mothers grabbed their children, leading them down into the safety of underground shelters, praying that the walls around them would hold. Fathers clutched their wives, trying to stay brave, knowing there was little they could do but wait. And then, the bombs would come. The ground shook with each impact, the air filled with the sound of crumbling buildings, shattering glass, and the cries of the wounded. In the quiet moments after the bombers had passed, the cities were left in ruins. Streets that had once been filled with life were now covered in debris, buildings reduced to nothing more than piles of rubble. Fires burned unchecked, casting an eerie glow over the devastation. And amid the destruction, the survivors emerged, covered in dust and ash, their faces etched with the grief of loss. Some had lost their homes, others their loved ones. But all had lost something that night, their sense of safety, the idea that they could ever be untouched by the war. Yet, even in the midst of such horror, there were moments of resilience. Strangers helped each other out of the rubble, pulling survivors from collapsed buildings. Communities came together to rebuild, even if it was only temporary, even if the bombs would come again the next night. The human spirit, it seemed, was harder to break than any wall of brick or stone. But the cost was staggering. Cities like Dresden, once known for their beauty and culture, were reduced to ashes. Tens of thousands of civilians lost their lives in a matter of hours. Hospitals, schools, and homes were destroyed in the blink of an eye. And for many, the psychological scars ran just as deep as the physical ones. Children who had grown up in the war knew nothing but fear. They had never known a world without the threat of bombers overhead, without the constant worry that everything they loved could be taken from them in an instant. For the Allies, the bombing campaign was a brutal necessity. The war had to be won, and weakening Germany's industrial power was key to that victory. Factories that produced tanks, planes, and ammunition were targeted with precision, and without these resources, the German army would eventually falter. The bombers flew day and night, often facing deadly resistance from anti-aircraft guns and enemy fighters. Many brave men never returned from their missions, their planes shot down in flames or lost over enemy territory. But as the war dragged on, questions began to arise. Was the destruction of entire cities justified? Could the loss of so many civilian lives ever be seen as necessary? These were questions that haunted not only the people on the ground, but also the soldiers in the air. Many struggled with the moral weight of their actions, knowing that every mission they flew brought death not only to soldiers, but to innocent men, women, and children. And yet, the war showed no mercy. It was a time when difficult decisions had to be made, when the line between right and wrong often became blurred in the chaos of battle. The bombing campaign, despite its horrors, played a role in the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. Factories stopped producing, supply lines were cut off, and the once mighty war machine ground to a halt. But victory came at a price. In the end, it wasn't just the buildings that were destroyed. Lives were shattered, families torn apart, and entire communities erased from existence. The memories of those who lived through the bombings would never fade. The sound of air raid sirens, the sight of fire lighting up the night sky, the feeling of helplessness as bombs rained down, these were the scars they carried with them long after the war had ended. For the survivors, there was no easy way to move on. The war had taken so much from them, homes, loved ones, and a sense of security that might never return. But amid the ruins, there was also a determination to rebuild, to reclaim what had been lost. They knew that the war had to end, that the world had to heal. And as the fires burned out and the rubble was cleared away, there was hope that someday, peace would come. The Allied bombing campaign was a testament to the brutal nature of war, where even the most justified actions could lead to unimaginable suffering. It was a reminder that war touches everyone, from the soldiers on the front lines to the civilians trying to survive in their homes. But it was also a story of resilience, of people finding the strength to endure even in the face of overwhelming destruction. And as the cities of Germany lay in ruins, it was the people who stood among them, scarred but unbroken, who showed the world that even in the darkest times, hope could still survive. The Eastern Front was a battlefield of staggering scale, a place where the bitter cold and the cries of men fused into a harsh symphony of war. It was here, in the endless plains of Russia, that the tide of war began to turn, where the mighty Soviet army, bruised but unbroken, would rise from the ashes of earlier defeats and begin a relentless push westward. The blood-soaked soil of this land had witnessed horrors beyond imagining, but now it would see something else, the stirrings of hope, the spark of a brutal, hard-earned victory. It was 1943, and the winds of war were shifting. The Battle of Kursk would be the first hammer blow. The Germans, desperate to regain the upper hand, threw everything they had into the largest tank battle the world had ever seen. The clash of metal upon metal echoed across the Russian steppe as thousands of tanks rumbled into each other. Flames erupted as shells found their marks, and the very earth seemed to tremble under the weight of the machines and the death they brought. The Germans had hoped for a swift victory, a decisive blow that would break the Soviet spirit once and for all. But the Red Army had learned from its past mistakes. This time, they were prepared. The Soviet defenses were layered deep, built with cunning and grit, waiting for the moment when the enemy would falter. And when the Germans began to slow, when their advance lost its momentum, the Soviet counteroffensive hit with a ferocity no one could have imagined. The once invincible German panzers, symbols of Nazi power, found themselves engulfed in a sea of red, Soviet tanks, artillery, and soldiers storming forward with an unstoppable will. The victory at Kursk wasn't just a military triumph, it was a symbol. It was the moment the Soviet Union began to truly believe they could win this war. The Germans, for all their might, could be defeated. And from that moment on, defeat was no longer an option. The Red Army, forged in the fires of hardship, began its march westward, pushing the invaders out of their homeland, step by agonizing step. The counteroffensives that followed were nothing short of brutal. City by city, village by village, the Soviets fought to reclaim what had been taken from them. The landscape, already scarred by years of war, was ravaged further as battles raged on. Every inch of ground was paid for in blood, every advance came at the cost of lives, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. But still, they pressed on. For the soldiers on the front lines, there was no other choice. Many had seen their homes burned, their families torn apart by the violence of the Nazi occupation. They fought not just for survival, but for vengeance, for justice, for a future where their children could grow up free from the shadow of tyranny. The pain they endured, the losses they suffered, only hardened their resolve. With each step westward, they were reclaiming more than just territory, they were reclaiming their dignity, their pride, their very existence. As the Soviet forces pushed into Eastern Europe, they encountered the full horror of Nazi occupation. Towns and villages, once vibrant with life, lay in ruins. The people they liberated, those who had survived the terror of the Nazi regime, were gaunt, hollow-eyed, starving. The Nazis had left nothing but devastation in their wake, a reminder of the cruelty that had driven this war from the very beginning. The Red Army, having already witnessed so much death, so much suffering, found their determination renewed by the sight of these broken lands and broken people. They would not stop. They could not stop. The advance was slow and costly. Winter had once been an ally to the Soviets, but now it became an additional challenge. The bitter cold gnawed at the soldiers' bones as they trudged through the snow, their breath freezing in the air, their bodies weary but their spirits unyielding. The supplies were often scarce, and the nights were long and dark, filled with the distant sound of artillery and the occasional crack of gunfire. Yet, with each passing day, they moved closer to their goal, closer to Germany, closer to the heart of the Nazi regime. And then, as the winter began to thaw and the ground turned to mud, the Red Army reached the cities of Eastern Europe, Warsaw, Bucharest, Budapest. The Nazis had fortified these cities, turning them into strongholds, determined to make the Soviets pay dearly for every street, every building. But the Soviet soldiers, hardened by years of battle, fought on with an almost supernatural resolve. They tore through enemy lines, liberated concentration camps, and freed the people who had lived under the boot of oppression for too long. The cost of each battle was unimaginable, but the joy of liberation, the sight of people finally free, was a balm to the wounds of war. Yet, even as the Soviet army tasted victory, the war was far from over. The closer they came to Germany, the fiercer the resistance grew. The Nazis, realizing that the walls were closing in, fought with a desperation born of fear. But the Soviets had come too far to turn back. They had suffered too much, lost too many, to be denied now. The liberation of Eastern Europe was not just a military campaign, it was a human triumph. It was the story of a people who had been brought to the brink of destruction and had clawed their way back through sheer will and sacrifice. And as the Red Army pushed forward, they knew that each step brought them closer to ending the nightmare that had gripped their world for so long. In the end, the Soviet advance on the Eastern Front was not just about territory. It was about reclaiming the future. It was about the millions who had died in the struggle, the families torn apart, the lives shattered by the brutal machinery of war. And it was about hope, hope that after all the bloodshed, all the pain, there could be peace. But peace was still a distant dream. For now, the Red Army continued its relentless march, the sound of their boots pounding the frozen earth, their eyes fixed on the horizon, where the final battle awaited them. The battle for victory. The battle for justice. The battle for the very soul of a continent. The sound of the waves crashing against the metal hulls of the landing crafts echoed in the hearts of the soldiers. The early morning sky was gray, heavy with the weight of the unknown. Fear, hope, and duty mingled in the air as young men clutched their rifles, their faces etched with determination. June 6, 1944, D-Day. It was the day that would define a generation. The shores of Normandy lay ahead, silent and ominous, but everyone knew they would not stay silent for long. Inside the landing crafts, the soldiers tried to steady their hands and quiet their minds. They thought of their homes, their families, and their comrades beside them. There was no turning back. The sea churned as if it, too, understood the gravity of what was to come. When the doors of the landing crafts dropped, the world exploded into chaos. Gunfire, explosions, and the screams of men filled the air, drowning out any thoughts of fear or doubt. The beach, once so serene, became a killing field. Bullets whizzed past, mortar shells erupted, and the sea turned red with the blood of those who had barely touched the sand. Soldiers staggered forward, some falling before they could take another step, but still, they pressed on. The cliffs above were fortified with German soldiers, entrenched behind walls of steel and concrete, raining down death upon the Allies. But the men on the beach did not stop. They couldn't. They moved forward with the weight of the world on their shoulders, knowing that failure was not an option. This was more than a battle, it was the beginning of the end of the war. It had to be. Somewhere in the middle of the chaos, the soldiers found their courage. They crawled through the sand, through the blood, through the broken bodies of their friends, inching closer to the German lines. Every step felt like an eternity, every movement a struggle between life and death. And yet, they moved, step by agonizing step. The beaches of Normandy were not just a battlefield, they were a crucible, a place where bravery was tested in its most brutal form. The stakes were immense. This wasn't just about surviving the day, it was about liberating a continent, about freeing millions from the grip of tyranny. The soldiers knew that, and despite the carnage around them, they fought with a kind of strength that can only come from belief. Belief that what they were doing mattered. That they were part of something far greater than themselves. The air was thick with smoke, the ground shaking with every explosion, and still, the Allies pushed forward. As they climbed the cliffs and broke through the German defenses, they knew that this was the turning point. The losses were heavy, the cost unspeakable, but the spirit of those men was unbreakable. They fought for every inch, every foot of sand, knowing that behind them, the entire world was watching and waiting, hoping for victory. By the end of that day, thousands of soldiers lay dead or wounded on the shores of Normandy, their sacrifice etched into the very fabric of history. But they had done it. The beachhead was secure, the first steps toward the liberation of France had been taken. And though the battle was far from over, the tide had turned. Operation Overlord, as the invasion was called, was a massive undertaking. Months of planning, coordination, and sacrifice had led to this moment. The Allied forces, American, British, Canadian, and others, had come together in a united front to strike a blow against Nazi-occupied Europe. It wasn't just the men on the beaches who played a role in this victory. Behind them, in the skies, were the planes that had bombed the German fortifications, and in the sea, the ships that had brought them to shore, providing covering fire as the soldiers made their way inland. For the people of France, the invasion meant hope. After years of living under Nazi rule, the sound of gunfire on the beaches signaled that liberation was near. In the towns and villages beyond the shores, people whispered prayers, knowing that freedom was within reach, but also fearing the devastation that the war would bring to their doorsteps. As the Allies pushed further into France, the German forces, so confident in their defenses, began to crumble. The beachheads expanded, and soon the soldiers were not just fighting for their lives, but for the liberation of an entire country. Normandy became the stage for a fierce battle between the Allied forces and the German occupiers. Each town liberated, each road secured, brought the Allies closer to Paris, closer to ending the nightmare of occupation. But the cost was staggering. The liberation of France did not come without loss, and each victory was paid for in blood. The men who stormed the beaches knew that many would not return, and yet they fought with a resolve that came from the very depths of their souls. They fought for their comrades who had fallen, for the people of France, for the world that needed them to succeed. And succeed they did. As the Allies pushed further inland, the French resistance played their part, rising up against their occupiers in acts of defiance and sabotage. Ordinary men and women, who had waited in the shadows for their moment, now stood side by side with the soldiers, fighting for the freedom of their homeland. Together, they pushed the Germans back, inch by inch, until the liberation of Paris was within sight. For the people of France, D-Day was more than the beginning of a military campaign, it was the beginning of hope. The sight of Allied soldiers marching through their towns and villages brought tears to the eyes of those who had endured years of suffering. The liberation of France was not just a military victory, but a human one, a victory of hope over fear, of freedom over oppression. And so, the invasion that began in the cold gray dawn of June 6, 1944, became the turning point in a war that had consumed the world. The men who stormed the beaches of Normandy knew that their actions would ripple through history, that their bravery would be remembered long after the guns had fallen silent. They fought for a future they believed in, for a world that could be free again. And though the cost was immense, the courage and sacrifice of those soldiers paved the way for the liberation of Europe and the eventual defeat of the Nazi regime. The roar of the ocean was drowned out by the sound of aircraft engines and gunfire. The dense jungles of the Pacific Islands hid enemies waiting to strike, and the skies above were filled with the echoes of war. For the men who found themselves far from home, these islands were no paradise. They were the front lines in a brutal and relentless struggle, a fight for every inch of land, every hill, every beachhead. It was 1942, and the island of Guadalcanal was the first battleground in what would become known as the Pacific Island Hopping Campaign. This strategy, devised by the Allied forces, was simple yet deadly. The goal was to capture key islands, one by one, inching ever closer to Japan itself. But what seemed straightforward on paper turned into a bloody test of endurance, courage, and willpower for every soldier involved. The moment the landing crafts approached Guadalcanal, the humid air grew tense with fear and anticipation. The soldiers knew that once their boots hit the sand, it would be a fight for survival. They couldn't see the enemy, but they could feel them, hidden in the dense foliage, waiting in silence. As soon as the first wave of soldiers landed, the island erupted into chaos. Gunfire cracked through the air, grenades exploded, and the once quiet beach was transformed into a battlefield. For months, the struggle for Guadalcanal raged on. The heat was suffocating, the terrain unforgiving, and the jungles seemed alive with danger. Disease and exhaustion were as much enemies as the Japanese soldiers, who fought fiercely to hold their ground. But the men of the Allied forces, despite the overwhelming odds, refused to give up. Inch by inch, they clawed their way forward, driven by the belief that every victory, no matter how small, brought them closer to ending the war. The victory at Guadalcanal came at a high cost. Many never returned, but those who survived knew they had made a difference. This was only the beginning. The Allies' path toward Japan was paved with the blood of brave men who fought in battles where survival was never guaranteed. The next target was the small but heavily fortified island of Tarawa. From a distance, it seemed like any other island in the Pacific, a stretch of sand surrounded by crystal-clear waters. But hidden beneath its beauty was a fortress. The Japanese had turned the island into a deadly trap, and they were prepared to defend it at all costs. The landing at Tarawa was met with fierce resistance. As the soldiers stormed the beaches, they found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire. The sea itself seemed to betray them, with coral reefs that forced the landing crafts to stop short, leaving the men to wade through waist-deep water under heavy fire. Many didn't make it to shore, their bodies claimed by the ocean before they could even set foot on land. Those who did were met with a hail of bullets from hidden bunkers and pillboxes. The battle for Tarawa was brutal. The Japanese defenders fought with a tenacity that shocked the Allied forces. Every inch of the island was contested, and the cost in lives was staggering. Yet, despite the horrors they faced, the soldiers pressed on. They fought for their comrades who had fallen, for the mission they believed in, and for the hope that each victory brought them closer to peace. When the battle finally ended, the island of Tarawa lay in ruins, and the cost of victory was etched in the faces of the men who survived. These battles were not just about conquering islands. They were about breaking the will of an enemy that refused to surrender. The soldiers knew that each island they took brought them one step closer to Japan, but each step was paid for in blood. The Pacific was not just a battlefield, it was a graveyard for many who gave their lives in pursuit of freedom. With every victory, the Allies moved closer to the heart of the Japanese Empire. The island-hopping strategy was proving effective, but the closer they got to Japan, the fiercer the resistance became. The jungles, beaches, and hills of these islands became the sites of unimaginable sacrifice. Yet, amidst the suffering, there was a sense of purpose that drove the soldiers forward. They were fighting not just for themselves, but for a world free from tyranny, a world where their children and their children's children could live without the shadow of war hanging over them. As the Allied forces pushed through the Pacific, the men who fought in these battles carried the weight of their fallen comrades with them. The victories were hard-won, and the losses were devastating, but each battle brought them closer to the ultimate goal, the defeat of Japan. From Guadalcanal to Tarawa, and on to the next islands, the soldiers knew that the war in the Pacific was far from over. But with every step they took, they could feel the momentum shifting in their favor. The Japanese, once so confident in their dominance of the Pacific, were now on the defensive. The Allies had found their strength in unity and their unwavering belief in the righteousness of their cause. For the soldiers who fought in the Pacific Island hopping campaign, the journey was long, the battles were brutal, and the price of victory was steep. But they fought with the knowledge that their efforts were part of something much larger than themselves. They were fighting for a future, for a world where the horrors of war would one day be nothing more than a memory. As they moved from island to island, the soldiers carried with them the hope that each battle would bring them closer to the end of the war. And with every victory, they inched closer to Japan, closer to the heart of an empire that had once seemed unstoppable. The Pacific, once dominated by the Japanese, was now the stage for the Allies' relentless march toward victory. For those who fought and for those who fell, the Pacific Island hopping campaign was more than a military strategy, it was a testament to the courage, endurance, and sacrifice of the men who gave everything for the promise of a better tomorrow. The war was far from over, but the tide had begun to turn, and the soldiers who fought on those distant islands knew that, no matter the cost, they were making history. They were paving the way for the final push toward peace, one battle at a time. The streets of occupied Europe were not quiet. Beneath the surface, far from the eyes of the oppressors, hearts burned with defiance. The sky may have been dark with the shadow of tyranny, but hope flickered in the unlikeliest corners, in hidden basements, on rooftops, and deep within forests. These were the places where ordinary men and women, refusing to bow to terror, rose to fight back. They were the resistance, a force that couldn't be conquered by guns or fear. In France, whispers filled the air long before a single shot was fired. The French resistance was not born of soldiers but of teachers, farmers, shopkeepers, and students. The occupation brought humiliation, but it also sowed seeds of rebellion. While some chose to survive quietly, others found courage in risking everything. They forged networks in the shadows, passing messages through coded notes or by a simple knock on a door. Their weapons were sabotage, secrecy, and, most of all, unity. Night after night, they risked their lives, blowing up bridges, derailing trains, and cutting communication lines. Each act, no matter how small, chipped away at the German stranglehold. Sometimes they were betrayed, captured, or killed, but for every resistance fighter lost, another took their place. The resistance never stopped. One of their greatest victories came in the days leading up to D-Day. As the Allied forces prepared to storm the beaches of Normandy, the resistance went to work. They sabotaged railroads, ambushed convoys, and destroyed communication centers, delaying German reinforcements. Without these brave men and women working behind enemy lines, the success of the Normandy invasion might have been very different. Their bravery was a testament to what people can do when freedom is at stake. In Poland, where the suffering under Nazi rule was unbearable, the Warsaw Uprising became a symbol of unimaginable courage. The people of Warsaw had already endured so much: starvation, forced labor, and the horrors of the ghetto, but in 1944, they decided enough was enough. Armed with little more than homemade bombs, pistols, and an unbreakable spirit, the citizens of Warsaw rose up against their occupiers. For 63 brutal days, they fought tooth and nail. The sound of gunfire echoed through the streets, and the smell of burning buildings filled the air. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but their hearts were stronger than any weapon. The uprising wasn't just about survival, it was a battle for dignity, for a city that refused to kneel. Families were torn apart as fathers and sons went into battle, mothers and daughters passed ammunition, and children acted as messengers. The sight of civilians standing shoulder to shoulder, refusing to give in, was a sight of both tragedy and glory. They held out longer than anyone had expected, but in the end, the uprising was crushed. The city lay in ruins, and thousands of lives were lost, but the spirit of resistance was never broken. Warsaw, though devastated, would rise again. Beyond France and Poland, resistance movements sparked across Europe like wildfires. In Norway, saboteurs blew up heavy water plants to slow the German atomic program. In Yugoslavia, partisans under the command of Josip Tito waged a fierce guerrilla war, striking German forces from the mountains and forests. Each act of defiance, each small victory, sent ripples across Europe, showing the world that the people would not simply stand by and watch as their countries were consumed by darkness. Women played a critical role in the resistance, often going unnoticed by their enemies. While men carried out many of the sabotage operations, it was often women who carried the messages, forged the documents, and smuggled weapons and supplies. They hid soldiers in their homes, helped downed pilots escape, and risked everything to keep the resistance alive. Their bravery was immense, even though history has not always given them the recognition they deserve. For these resistance fighters, the price of failure was unimaginable. Those caught faced torture, execution, or deportation to concentration camps. Yet, knowing the risks, they continued. Their mission was never just about military success. It was about holding on to the belief that even in the darkest times, humanity could stand tall against oppression. The stories of these movements are filled with acts of incredible courage, but they are also stories of pain and loss. Families were destroyed, communities torn apart, and countless lives sacrificed. But through it all, the resistance was a beacon of hope for occupied Europe. It showed that no matter how strong an oppressor might seem, the will of the people could never be fully extinguished. By the time the war ended, many resistance fighters had paid the ultimate price, but their legacy lived on. They were not soldiers with uniforms or medals. They were ordinary people who found extraordinary strength when their world was turned upside down. Their resistance was not just about defeating an enemy, but about preserving their humanity in the face of brutality. And in doing so, they became heroes in the truest sense. The victory they fought for was not just about winning battles or liberating cities. It was about the triumph of the human spirit, of people who refused to be silenced, who fought for a future free of fear, and who showed the world that even in the face of unimaginable terror, courage could still shine through. The city of Paris had waited, endured, and hoped. Under the crushing weight of Nazi occupation, its streets once filled with laughter had turned silent, burdened by fear. But in the summer of 1944, a change was coming, a change that would echo not only through the streets of Paris but across all of Western Europe. The long nights of oppression were about to end, and with it, the first breath of freedom would finally be felt again. It started with whispers, rumors carried by those brave enough to resist. The Allies were advancing. France could feel the tremors of approaching liberation, as cities and villages across the country were slowly being freed from the Nazi grip. It wasn't just soldiers fighting for this freedom, it was the people themselves, the men and women who had never lost faith, who had defied occupation, and whose spirit had refused to break. As the Allied forces pushed through Normandy, their path led them closer to Paris. Inside the city, the resistance movement, who had spent years living in the shadows, sabotaging German efforts and keeping hope alive, now prepared for something bigger. They knew that their time had come. Weapons were smuggled, plans were made, and the Parisians, who had long been quiet out of fear, were ready to rise. The city that had once bowed to occupation would now fight for its own freedom. And then, on August 19, 1944, the uprising began. The sound of gunfire echoed through the streets as the French resistance clashed with the occupying forces. Barricades were built in the heart of Paris, echoing a defiance that had been simmering for years. Parisians, both young and old, took to the streets, arming themselves with whatever they could find. For days, the city was a battleground, with every street corner, every alley, witnessing the bravery of ordinary people fighting for the right to live free. But Paris was not alone. Outside its borders, the Allied forces were closing in. American, British, and Free French troops, led by General Charles de Gaulle, moved swiftly toward the city. Each step forward marked not just a military victory but a symbolic one, a declaration that the tyranny of occupation was coming to an end. When the first Allied tanks rolled into the city on August 24th, the air was thick with a mix of gunpowder and hope. The cheers of liberated Parisians were louder than the sounds of battle. As soldiers pushed through the boulevards, the reality of liberation washed over the city. The enemy was being driven out, and with them, the darkness that had suffocated Paris for 4 long years. The Nazi flags that once flew over the city were torn down, replaced by the French tricolor, a symbol of freedom, of resilience, and of a city that had never truly surrendered. On August 25th, the formal surrender came. General Dietrich von Choltitz, the German military governor of Paris, defied Hitler's orders to destroy the city and chose instead to surrender. Paris was free. The news spread like wildfire. For Parisians, it felt like the dawn after a long, suffocating night. De Gaulle marched through the streets with his head held high, greeted by throngs of people who had waited so long for this moment. His words resonated with the people. Paris. Paris outraged. Paris broken. Paris martyred. But Paris liberated. But the liberation of Paris was just the beginning. With the fall of the Nazi stronghold in France, the door was now open for the Allies to advance further. Belgium, under the weight of German occupation, had also suffered. Its cities had been bombed, its people terrorized. Yet, just like in France, there was hope. And when the Allied forces arrived, the Belgian people came out in droves to greet them, waving flags, embracing soldiers, and weeping tears of joy. Brussels, the capital, was liberated in early September, and with it, Belgium's long nightmare was drawing to a close. The liberation of the Netherlands, however, would not come as swiftly. The Dutch had been under brutal occupation for years. Their cities had been ravaged, their people starved, and their resistance fighters hunted. But they too refused to give up. In September 1944, the Allies launched Operation Market Garden, a daring plan to push through the Netherlands and into Germany. While the operation didn't go as smoothly as hoped, it ignited the flame of resistance once more. As the Allied forces pressed into Dutch territory, the people rose, aiding their liberators, despite the dangers. In the cities of Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Maastricht, the Dutch people tasted freedom again. But for those in the north, liberation wouldn't come until the following spring. The winter of 1944, known as the Hunger Winter, was one of unimaginable suffering. Yet, despite the hardship, the Dutch people held on. They knew that their freedom was close, and they were willing to endure just a little longer. Across Western Europe, liberation was a tidal wave, sweeping away years of terror and occupation. With each city freed, the sense of victory grew stronger. It wasn't just about military victories on the battlefield, it was about reclaiming the soul of a continent that had been pushed to the brink. As the Allied forces marched through the streets of liberated towns and cities, they were greeted not just as soldiers but as symbols of hope. The faces of those they freed told stories of suffering, resilience, and an unbreakable spirit. The liberation of Western Europe was not just about the end of war. It was about the triumph of humanity over oppression. It was about people who had faced unimaginable horrors but had never given up the belief that one day they would be free. As France, Belgium, and the Netherlands shook off the chains of occupation, they stood together, a testament to the power of unity and the undying human spirit. The air was bitterly cold, and the forests of the Ardennes were blanketed in snow, a silent witness to what was about to unfold. It was December 1944, and though the end of the war seemed near, the world didn't know that Hitler was planning one last desperate gamble. The Battle of the Bulge would become one of the bloodiest and most brutal battles of World War II. Soldiers, weary from years of fighting, would find themselves thrown into the heart of winter, facing an enemy that refused to surrender. For the Allies, victory in Western Europe appeared to be within reach. Paris had been liberated, and the Nazi war machine was reeling from losses on both fronts. But in the icy forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, something unexpected was stirring. Hitler, grasping at his last hope, devised a plan to split the Allied lines and recapture the Belgian port of Antwerp, a move that could cripple the Allied advance and buy Germany more time. It was bold, reckless, and would come at a terrible cost. On the morning of December 16th, the quiet of the Ardennes was shattered. Artillery fire thundered through the trees as German forces launched their surprise attack. The initial shock was overwhelming. Thousands of German troops, along with tanks and artillery, surged into the Allied lines. Soldiers who had thought the war was winding down now found themselves under siege. The weather worked in the Germans' favor. Thick fog and snow grounded Allied planes, giving the Germans the cover they needed to advance. It was a blitz, a sudden and furious strike, and for many Allied soldiers, it felt like the darkest moment of the war. The German offensive created a bulge in the Allied lines, giving the battle its name. Entire divisions were caught off guard, forced to retreat or face annihilation. In those first chaotic days, it seemed as though the Germans might actually succeed. Towns and villages were swallowed by the advancing Nazi forces. The cold was merciless, freezing both soldiers and machines alike. For the Americans and their allies, this was more than just a fight for survival, it was a battle against despair. In the town of Bastogne, American forces became surrounded. The 101st Airborne Division, cut off from supplies and reinforcements, dug in for what would become a legendary defense. The Germans demanded their surrender, but the Americans refused. General Anthony McAuliffe's famous response, "Nuts," embodied the defiance and courage that would come to define this battle. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, the defenders of Bastogne held their ground. The snow-covered town became a symbol of resistance, a place where the Allies would make their stand against the Nazi onslaught. As the battle raged, soldiers on both sides endured unimaginable hardship. The cold was an enemy all its own. Soldiers huddled in foxholes, their bodies shaking from the freezing temperatures, their breath visible in the air. Frostbite claimed as many men as bullets. Supplies were scarce, and food was hard to come by. But even as the snow fell heavily around them, even as the darkness of winter seemed to close in, they fought on. It wasn't just the soldiers who suffered. Civilians caught in the crossfire faced their own horrors. Families hid in basements, praying for the sound of gunfire to stop. Homes were reduced to rubble, and entire villages became ghost towns. The pain of war was everywhere, and for those who survived, the memory of those days would haunt them for the rest of their lives. But despite the grim odds, the tide of the battle began to turn. As the skies cleared, Allied planes took to the air, delivering much-needed supplies to the besieged troops in Bastogne and launching devastating attacks on German positions. Reinforcements arrived, and slowly, the German advance was halted. The Allies regrouped, counterattacking with fierce determination. Each mile they pushed back felt like a victory carved from stone, earned with blood and sacrifice. The Battle of the Bulge dragged on for weeks, with fighting as intense as anything seen during the war. German soldiers, many of them young and inexperienced, fought with the desperation of a regime in its final throes. The losses on both sides were staggering. Towns that had changed hands multiple times were nothing but ruins, their streets littered with the debris of war. By mid-January, the German offensive had been repelled. The bulge in the Allied lines was gone, and the Germans were in retreat. Hitler's gamble had failed. The price paid for this failure was immense, thousands of lives lost, entire divisions shattered. The Battle of the Bulge would go down in history as one of the largest and most costly battles fought by American forces during the war. But beyond the statistics, beyond the strategic victories and defeats, there was something deeper that came out of those frozen forests. It was the resilience of the human spirit. The men who fought in the Ardennes, who endured the cold, the hunger, and the terror of battle, did so because they believed in something greater than themselves. They fought for freedom, for their comrades, and for the hope that one day the world would be free from the shadow of tyranny. As the snow melted and the ground thawed, the scars of the battle remained. The forest was littered with the remnants of war, broken tanks, discarded weapons, and the bodies of those who would never return home. For the soldiers who survived, the memories of the Battle of the Bulge would never fade. It was a testament to their courage and to the high cost of victory. And for the world, it was a turning point. The failure of Hitler's last great offensive signaled the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. The Allies were now on the road to victory, and though the war was not yet over, the end was in sight. The Battle of the Bulge was more than just a battle. It was a crucible in which the fate of Europe was decided. Through the cold and the chaos, through the darkness and the despair, the light of freedom burned brightly. The streets of Berlin were filled with a haunting silence, interrupted only by the distant rumble of artillery fire. It was April 1945, and the once glorious capital of Nazi Germany was now a city on the verge of collapse. The Soviet Red Army was closing in, their relentless advance bringing the end of the Third Reich closer with every passing day. The walls of Berlin, once a symbol of power, were now crumbling under the weight of war. For those trapped inside, the air was thick with fear and desperation. For Adolf Hitler, the man who had once envisioned a 1,000-year empire, the dream was over. The promises of victory, the grand speeches, and the brutal campaigns that had devastated Europe were all crumbling before his eyes. He had retreated into the depths of his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, surrounded by a handful of loyal followers. But even within the cold, concrete walls of his underground refuge, the sound of the Soviet guns echoed through the city, a constant reminder that the end was near. Outside, the Soviet forces were advancing with brutal efficiency. Marshal Zhukov's armies encircled Berlin, and the German soldiers, many of them mere boys or old men, fought a hopeless battle against an overwhelming tide. The once mighty Wehrmacht was shattered, their resources depleted, and their morale in tatters. The Soviets, fueled by their desire for revenge after years of suffering under the Nazi war machine, pushed forward without mercy. For them, Berlin was the final prize, the symbol of their victory. As the Soviet troops moved through the outskirts of the city, they encountered fierce resistance. The fighting was brutal, street by street, building by building. German snipers hid in the ruins, picking off soldiers one by one. But the Soviets were unstoppable. Tanks rolled over barricades, and artillery shells rained down on the remnants of Berlin's defenses. The city was burning, its once proud architecture reduced to rubble. For the civilians trapped in the midst of this nightmare, there was no escape. Families huddled in basements, listening to the bombs falling around them. The sound of footsteps above filled them with dread, not knowing whether it would be the Soviets or the last remnants of the Nazi regime coming to their door. Hunger, fear, and despair consumed the city. Some tried to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The Soviets had closed the ring around Berlin, and escape was impossible. In his bunker, Hitler refused to face reality. He gave orders for troops that no longer existed, clinging to the hope that some miracle would save his regime. But there were no miracles left. As the Soviets breached the city's defenses and moved closer to the heart of Berlin, even those closest to Hitler began to see the truth. The Third Reich was finished. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler made his final decision. With the Soviets just a few blocks away from his bunker, he retreated to his private quarters with his wife, Eva Braun, whom he had married just hours before. Together, they ended their lives, Hitler with a pistol shot, and Eva Braun with poison. Their bodies were burned, as per his instructions, in a desperate attempt to erase the physical remnants of the man who had brought so much death and destruction to the world. But even as Hitler's life came to a bitter end, the battle for Berlin raged on. The Soviets continued their advance, closing in on the Reichstag, the seat of Nazi power. On May 2, 1945, the German forces in Berlin surrendered. The Red Army raised the Soviet flag over the ruins of the Reichstag, a moment that would forever symbolize the fall of Nazi Germany. The streets of Berlin were left in ruins. The city, once a symbol of Nazi dominance, was now a graveyard of broken buildings and shattered dreams. For the Soviets, it was a victory that came at a terrible cost. Thousands of lives had been lost in the battle, and the scars of the war would remain for generations to come. But for the world, the fall of Berlin meant one thing: the war in Europe was finally over. For the people of Berlin, however, the nightmare was far from over. The city was divided, broken, and occupied by the victorious Allied powers. The Soviets, driven by years of suffering and loss at the hands of the Nazis, exacted their revenge on the city. The horrors of war continued as the people of Berlin endured the brutal aftermath of the battle. As the Soviet soldiers marched through the streets, the civilians who had survived the battle emerged from their hiding places. Their city, their homes, and their lives had been destroyed. Families were torn apart, and the dead lay in the streets. The war had taken everything from them. But in the midst of the devastation, there was also a sense of relief. The nightmare of Nazi rule had come to an end. Hitler was dead, and the tyranny that had gripped Germany for more than a decade was over. The people of Berlin, though broken and battered, could begin to hope for a future free from fear. The fall of Berlin marked the collapse of the Third Reich, a regime that had brought untold suffering to millions across Europe. It was the end of Hitler's reign of terror, and with his death, the war that had torn the world apart was nearing its final moments. But for those who had lived through it, the memories of the battle, the destruction, and the loss would never fade. The city of Berlin, once a symbol of power, would forever bear the scars of the war. As the dust settled and the city began to rebuild, the world looked toward a new future. The fall of Berlin was not just the end of a battle, it was the end of an era. A new chapter in history was beginning, but the shadows of the past would linger for many years to come. The battle had been won, but the cost of victory was immeasurable. Berlin, a city once filled with the hopes and dreams of a nation, had fallen, and with it, the final remnants of the Third Reich had crumbled into the ashes of history. The morning sky over Hiroshima was deceptively peaceful on August 6, 1945. The city was awake, bustling with life, unaware of the shadow of death that loomed above. In an instant, everything changed. A blinding flash, brighter than the sun, lit up the sky. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then came the blast, a wave of unimaginable force that ripped through the city, flattening buildings, hurling debris, and incinerating everything in its path. The atomic bomb, a weapon like no other, had been unleashed on humanity. In seconds, thousands of lives were erased. The heat was so intense that people standing near the epicenter simply vanished, leaving behind only faint shadows on the ground. Those further away were thrown by the blast, their bodies burned, broken, and scarred beyond recognition. The devastation was total, and the silence that followed was as chilling as the destruction itself. Hiroshima, a thriving city just moments before, was now a landscape of horror. Fire spread uncontrollably, engulfing the remnants of what had once been homes, schools, and businesses. Survivors, dazed and in shock, wandered through the ruins, their skin hanging in shreds, their cries for help swallowed by the enormity of the catastrophe. The air was thick with ash, smoke, and the sickening stench of burning flesh. Parents searched frantically for their children, husbands for their wives, but many found nothing. The city had become a graveyard. 3 days later, on August 9th, the unimaginable happened again, this time in Nagasaki. As the people of Japan tried to grasp the horror of what had occurred in Hiroshima, another atomic bomb fell. Another flash, another blast, another city reduced to ash and rubble. Nagasaki's fate was sealed in the same way, its people caught in a nightmare they could never have imagined. Once again, lives were lost in an instant, and those who survived were left to endure the unbearable. The bombs were not just weapons, they were symbols of the unimaginable cruelty that war can bring. The power they unleashed was beyond anything the world had ever seen, and their impact would be felt for generations. The people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not just lose their homes or their loved ones, they lost their future. The radiation from the bombs poisoned the land, the water, and the very air they breathed. Many of those who survived the initial blast would later die slow, painful deaths from radiation sickness. Children born years after the bombs fell would carry the scars of that day, their bodies twisted and deformed by the invisible poison that lingered long after the explosions. For Japan, the devastation was beyond comprehension. The bombs had obliterated entire cities, but they had also shattered the spirit of a nation. Emperor Hirohito, faced with the destruction of his people and the knowledge that more bombs could come, made the agonizing decision to surrender. On August 15, 1945, the emperor addressed his people in a radio broadcast, his voice heavy with sorrow. He spoke of the new and most cruel bomb that had been dropped, and how continuing the war would only bring the total extinction of human civilization. The surrender marked the end of the Pacific War, but the wounds left by the atomic bombs would never fully heal. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became symbols of the cost of war, of the lives lost, the families torn apart, and the innocent people who suffered for the actions of nations. The bombs had brought the war to a close, but they had also unleashed a terror that the world could never forget. In the aftermath, the world struggled to comprehend what had happened. The sight of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, reduced to rubble and ash, was a grim reminder of the destructive power mankind had unleashed. The survivors, known as hibakusha, bore the physical and emotional scars of that day. Many were shunned, feared, and forgotten as the world moved on from the war. But they carried with them the memory of the moment the world changed forever. The atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not just acts of war, they were tragedies that redefined the meaning of suffering. For the people of Japan, they were the darkest moments in their history. For the world, they were a reminder of the terrible power of human invention and the responsibility that comes with it. And so, the war came to an end, not with a battle, but with the quiet devastation of two cities. The sun rose over Japan on August 15, 1945, just as it had every day before. But nothing was the same. The world had changed, and the shadow of the atomic bomb would linger over it forever. In the aftermath of World War II, the world was left grappling with the sheer horror of what had unfolded. The Holocaust had taken the lives of 6 million Jews and millions of others, including Roma, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and countless innocent civilians. The enormity of these atrocities hung heavily in the air, a haunting reminder of the depths of human cruelty. As the dust settled and the smoke of battle cleared, a pressing question arose: how could those responsible for such unimaginable suffering be held accountable? The answer came in the form of the Nuremberg trials, a series of military tribunals held in the city of Nuremberg, Germany. Here, amidst the remnants of the Nazi regime, the world took a stand against impunity. The trials represented a pivotal moment in the pursuit of justice, an attempt to confront the darkness that had enveloped Europe and to ensure that the architects of genocide would face the consequences of their actions. As the trials began in November 1945, the courtroom was filled with a mix of fear, anger, and a desperate yearning for closure. The defendants, high-ranking Nazi officials, sat in their seats, faces stone-cold and defiant, yet haunted by the reality of their circumstances. These men, once powerful leaders who had instigated terror and destruction, were now on trial for their lives. The world watched with bated breath, hoping for justice, but fearing that it might never come. Among the witnesses were survivors whose voices trembled with emotion as they recounted their harrowing experiences. They spoke of family members who had been torn away, of the brutalities they had witnessed, and of the camps where horror was an everyday reality. Each story was a piercing reminder of the suffering endured, echoing in the minds of those present. The pain and sorrow in the room were palpable as survivors faced their tormentors, recounting the unthinkable atrocities that had been inflicted upon them and their loved ones. Their testimonies became the heart of the trials, a means of humanizing the statistics that had often felt too overwhelming to grasp. The chief prosecutor, Justice Robert H. Jackson, delivered a powerful opening statement that reverberated through the courtroom. He declared that the trials were not just about punishing the guilty, but were also about establishing a moral reckoning. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, he said. Jackson's words resonated deeply, striking a chord in the hearts of those who had suffered, promising that their pain would not be forgotten. As evidence was presented, the horrors of the Nazi regime came to life in vivid detail. The world learned of the concentration camps, the gas chambers, and the brutal experiments conducted on innocent lives. Each photograph and piece of testimony painted a picture of unimaginable cruelty. The courtroom transformed into a space of raw emotion, where the haunting echoes of laughter, life, and hope lost were felt in every corner. Tears streamed down the faces of witnesses, and the weight of grief was shared by all present. The defendants tried to defend their actions, claiming they were simply following orders, but their arguments fell flat. The tribunal asserted that there is no defense for inhumanity. The world had seen too much suffering to allow excuses to overshadow accountability. Those in the dock were held to a standard that transcended national laws and regulations. They were judged by the moral compass of humanity itself, and that compass pointed firmly towards justice. As the trials progressed, the tension built. The verdicts were awaited with bated breath, and when they finally came, they were a mix of relief and sorrow. 12 of the defendants were sentenced to death, while others received prison sentences. Justice had been served, but at what cost? The weight of grief for the lost lives lingered, and the knowledge that not all perpetrators had been brought to justice cast a shadow over the proceedings. However, the Nuremberg trials marked a significant step forward in the global pursuit of accountability. In the end, the trials did more than bring some measure of justice to the victims. They established a precedent for international law, demonstrating that individuals could be held accountable for war crimes. The principles laid out in Nuremberg would shape the future of human rights law, guiding future efforts to prevent such atrocities from occurring again. They became a beacon of hope, reminding the world that there is a commitment to justice, even in the darkest of times. Yet, the scars of the past remain. The Nuremberg trials were a crucial moment in history, but they did not erase the pain and suffering endured by millions. The families shattered by the Holocaust, the communities destroyed, and the countless lives forever altered could not be restored. The trials stood as a solemn reminder of humanity's capacity for both good and evil, and the continuous struggle to ensure that such horrors never happen again. As the world reflected on the outcomes of the trials, it also recognized the importance of remembrance. Memorials were built, stories were shared, and the memories of those lost were honored. Survivors became witnesses not only to the atrocities they had faced, but also to the resilience of the human spirit. Their stories became a testament to the strength that can emerge from the depths of despair, fueling the resolve to prevent history from repeating itself. In the end, the Nuremberg trials were a blend of justice and sorrow, an attempt to shine a light on the darkest corners of human history. They stood as a testament to the idea that even in the face of overwhelming horror, there is a commitment to accountability and a hope for a better future. The echoes of those trials continue to resonate, reminding us all of the importance of standing against injustice, ensuring that the voices of the past are never silenced, and striving for a world where such atrocities are but a distant memory. The world stood on the brink of a new era, scarred yet resilient, as the dust settled after the devastation of World War II. Cities lay in ruins, families mourned their loved ones, and nations grappled with the overwhelming task of rebuilding. Yet, in this darkness, a flicker of hope began to emerge. The profound lessons learned from the war sparked a vision for a better future, a future where cooperation could triumph over conflict and where the voices of the people could unite against tyranny. It was in this fragile moment that the seeds for a new world were planted, giving rise to the United Nations. As delegates from around the globe gathered in San Francisco in 1945, their spirits were a mixture of determination and trepidation. Each representative carried the weight of their nation's past, filled with stories of loss and devastation. They knew that history must not repeat itself. Huddled together in that grand hall, they dreamed of a world governed by peace rather than fear. The air was thick with emotion as they crafted the United Nations Charter, a document born out of necessity and hope. It spoke not just of the need for peace, but of the importance of human dignity, justice, and the inalienable rights of all people. Among the voices in the assembly was Eleanor Roosevelt, whose grace and strength shone brightly. She was determined to ensure that the principles enshrined in the Charter would be a beacon for future generations. With every passionate word, she inspired those around her, reminding them that true peace could only be achieved through understanding and compassion. Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? She asked. In small places, close to home. Her words resonated deeply, igniting a shared commitment to honor the experiences of those who had suffered. The establishment of the United Nations was a monumental achievement, yet it was just the beginning. The world was still reeling from the scars of war, and tensions simmered beneath the surface. Nations sought security, but the specter of another conflict loomed large. The Cold War began to take shape, a standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union that would redefine global relations. Fear and uncertainty gripped many, as the divide between capitalism and communism threatened to fracture the newly formed alliances. In the aftermath of the war, Europe lay fractured and broken. The cities that had once been vibrant were now shadowed by destruction, their people searching for hope amidst the rubble. Nations had to reconcile their pasts while envisioning a new future. The Marshall Plan emerged as a lifeline, offering economic support to rebuild Europe and prevent the rise of extremist ideologies. It was a bold initiative that aimed not only to repair the physical structures but to foster a sense of unity among nations. As resources flowed into devastated communities, a sense of optimism began to blossom. People found work, families were reunited, and the once broken spirit of Europe started to heal. But while Europe sought to mend its wounds, Asia was also undergoing a profound transformation. Countries that had suffered under colonial rule began to assert their independence, yearning to forge their own destinies. Nations like India and Indonesia emerged from the shadows of colonialism, driven by a fierce desire for self-determination. Yet, this struggle for independence was often met with conflict and resistance. As people fought for their rights, the echoes of their determination rang out, reminding the world of the universal quest for freedom and justice. In the midst of these profound changes, the story of the post-war world was being written by the everyday lives of ordinary people. Families gathered around flickering candles in the evenings, sharing tales of hope and resilience. They found solace in each other's company, creating bonds that transcended borders and ideologies. People shared their dreams of a brighter tomorrow, whether through letters, songs, or the simple act of holding hands. Each moment of connection served as a reminder that humanity could triumph over division. But the shadow of the Cold War continued to loom, casting doubt on the possibility of lasting peace. The Berlin Wall, a stark division of ideology, rose to separate families and friends, encapsulating the fears of a world divided. Yet even in the face of such separation, the yearning for connection and understanding remained strong. Activists on both sides of the wall dared to challenge the status quo, advocating for peace and reconciliation. They understood that the scars of the past could only heal through dialogue and compassion. As the years rolled on, the United Nations became a platform for these voices to be heard. It was a space where nations could come together to discuss pressing issues, from human rights to poverty to the environment. The UN General Assembly became a stage for hopes and dreams, where leaders shared their visions for a world united by common goals. Each resolution passed echoed the enduring spirit of those early days in San Francisco, a testament to the belief that collective action could bring about real change. However, the road to peace was not without its challenges. Conflicts erupted in different corners of the globe, reminding everyone that the scars of war still ran deep. Yet, amid these trials, the spirit of resilience persisted. Communities rallied together, finding strength in unity. They refused to be defined by their struggles, embracing the power of hope as a guiding light. Activists, teachers, and parents nurtured the next generation, instilling in them the values of empathy and understanding. The legacy of the post-war world is etched in the hearts of those who dared to dream of a better future. It is a reminder that even in the face of adversity, humanity has the power to rise above. The United Nations stands as a symbol of hope, a testament to the belief that we can create a world where peace prevails. And as new generations continue to navigate the complexities of their time, they carry with them the stories of those who came before, a rich tapestry of resilience, compassion, and the unyielding pursuit of a brighter tomorrow.